Hey guys, I'm Yuruzi. This is part 2 of What If Naruto Went Rogue. After failing to save Sasuke, Naruto escapes the village. Now alone, on the run, and wielding the sword of the Demon of the Mist, Naruto tries to rebuild his life as a ninja. This will be a Naruto Temari pairing. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 9, Old Friends in New Places. Kirin let the cloth fall loose and smirked at Naruto's reaction. The sword looked mostly the same physically, but the blade had been stained with something to make it dark, almost black, and unreflective. It somehow made the sword look more sinister. Naruto reached out to touch it, but Kirin stopped him. Before you so much as touch this sword, Kirin said, you have to understand what it is. It has changed in many more ways than what you can see. Do you know why the 7 Mist Tenken are called that? Why they are called heavenly swords? Naruto shook his head. Because, Kirin continued, they are more than just swords, that is why they are given names, after all. Each Tenken is forged using a number of forbidden jutsus that allow it to contain a bit of its wielder's essence, and its powers reflect that. My brother Samahata can smell and eat chakra, showing our family's rather shark-like personalities. Kirin grinned, showing his pointed teeth, then continued, quickly becoming serious again. But it also means that taking up one of the Tenken is a lifelong commitment. The sword is part of you until the day you die. Zabuza never had that connection with his sword because the jutsus needed were never done, but you need to understand what you're getting into. Are you sure you still want to go through with this? Naruto thought back to his time with the blade over the last couple of months, how it had started to feel like an extension of his body, and smirked at Kirin. The sword is already a part of me, Naruto said, so it's only fair that I give it some of myself. Kirin nodded and carefully passed the sword to Naruto. Now, I'm not sure what's going to happen when we do this, Kirin said, most of the Tenken start looking something like that. He gestured to Kubikiri, when my brother did the blood ritual, his sword grew scales. Naruto raised an eyebrow but let Kirin continue. First of all, Kirin instructed, you need to carefully slit both your wrists with a kunai. Naruto nervously took out a kunai and did so. The blood ran freely. Now, Kirin continued, hold the sword upside down with both hands so your blood runs down the blade, and with the handle still between your hands, copy the hand seals I show you. Naruto did so, and as he finished and held the last seal, his blood soaked into the blade, his wrist wounds healed, and he felt something torn out of his body. He fell to one knee, leaning on the sword as a vortex of red and blue chakra spun around him. He felt an odd burning in his belly and looked down to see his seal spinning furiously, exactly as it had done with the Shikifujin Kai. Suddenly, he felt the chakra sucked back into his body, but he watched as the outer 2 seals on his stomach disappeared, leaving only the spiral seal. Naruto panicked for a moment, then took a deep breath and felt inside his body. He was pleasantly surprised to find the Kyuubi's chakra still sealed, exactly where it was supposed to be. But there was something missing, and he felt an odd tugging at the back of his mind. Hearing Kirin gasp slightly, he came back to the real world and had his breath stolen from him. The dark blade was now engraved, in the most precise detail, with the image of a blood-red 9-tailed fox locked in combat with a deep blue dragon. A moment later, the name inscribed near the handle started to shift, the kanji twisting and reforming to read Sirai Kirite, Spirit Cutter. As he sat there on the ground, he felt a feeling of confusion emanate from the sword and burst out in hysterical laughter. The sword had taken part of him, but it had also taken the soul of the Kyuubi. 15 minutes and a hell of a lot of explaining later, Kirin was nodding his head. When he thought about it, it made perfect sense. The jutsu was designed to take part of a person's soul, and no matter how powerful the seal, the Kyuubi's soul would be far less attached than Naruto's own, so the jutsu had taken it. This left Kyuubi's chakra inside Naruto, still happily mixing with the help of the remaining spiral seal, as well a confused demon fox inside the sword. That was another thing Naruto found odd. He could vaguely feel what the fox was feeling and thinking. Currently, said fox was very off balance. For years he had been in that cage, able to feel all his chakra but perceive nothing. Now, he could feel things around him, but drawing on chakra was like drinking the ocean through a straw. His feeling wasn't a form of sight exactly, just a perception of things nearby. He also found that he had a somewhat empathic connection to the brat. Naruto was sitting on the floor of Kirin's living room when he felt it, a slight pull on his chakra, and realized the fox was trying to draw on it from inside the sword. Curious, he loosened his chakra control and let the fox take some. The sword started to flicker with a red glow. Kirin walked back into the room to see Naruto holding the sword, which was surrounded by a fluctuating red aura. He sat down on the couch and observed the boy. Kirin had never seen a situation like this before and was fascinated. Further experimentation revealed that the Kyuubi, if given enough chakra, could manifest parts of his body. This resulted in no small number of nicks and gashes on Naruto, as the fox was still just a little irked about the arm severing incident. It was this, however, that led directly to the next discovery. Naruto could not only control how much chakra the fox got, he could use his own chakra to manifest. Nothing as complex as what the Kyuubi could manage. After all, Naruto had to his own body he had to worry about controlling. But he soon found he could send a small burst of chakra from the sword. Kirin suddenly broke the silence. "Now I get it," he exclaimed. Naruto was about to ask what Kirin got but didn't have time, as the shark man just kept speaking. "What was it you said before the ritual? That you felt the sword was part of your body. That's the power of your sword, to exude chakra from it as if it were a part of your body." But Kyuubi complicated things. That also explains the engraving. The red nine-tailed fox is obvious, but the blue dragon represents your chakra. Kirin rushed on, now completely lost in his own world. The two creatures in the engraving are fighting, but they're also intertwined, much as you must be. Therefore, your essence is mixed with the demons, and that's what's holding Kyuubi's soul in the sword. Naruto looked cautiously at Kirin. Meaning, Kirin said, sounding proud of himself, that the only reason Kyuubi still exists now that he's apart from his chakra is because he is, in the literal sense, now part of you. You aren't two separate beings anymore, you're one being with two minds and two chakras. As amazingly comforted as Naruto was by this thought, it meant that the fox would have to think twice before killing him, and that was a good thing. Kirin continued to speak, completely oblivious to the mood. "Now that that's over with, it's time for a sword-throwing lesson," he said with a grin. Naruto glared. He added a few fear stimuli for extra effect. "Or," Kirin continued, "we could start the lesson first thing tomorrow morning." Naruto nodded. He needed some time alone with his sword. Once Kirin was out of the room, Naruto gave Kyuubi enough chakra for the demon to manifest ahead. Naruto tried to play it cool, as if he had conversations with glowing red fox heads coming out of his sword every day. "Well, brat," the demon said, "this certainly is an interesting twist." "It changes little," Naruto replied. "You still need me to stay alive, and since I know how much you look forward to dying, I figure you'll contribute to my well-being no matter how much you hate me." Kyuubi laughed. "Yes, I suppose that's true. And I have to admit, this form allows me a great deal more freedom than that cage your belly in." Naruto cut him off. "Before anything, let's get one thing straight. We hate each other, correct?" The fox head nodded with a feral grin. "But you need me to give you access to chakra or you're about as useful as Sakura." The fox flinched. That had been harsh. "But I'm stuck with you either way. So here's how things work. You help me fight, which you love to do anyway, and in return, I'll give you chakra. The only rule is that if you ever hurt someone without what I think is a valid reason, I'll cut you off forever. Do we understand each other?" "I suppose," the demon said with just a hint of annoyance. He was stuck with the brat, so he would just take the opportunities to reap destruction as they came. 14 years in a cage had taught him some patience. Naruto sighed and collapsed on the floor as the head vanished. It was only supper time and he was exhausted. The evening was uneventful, and the next morning, Naruto was up bright and early, getting ready for his throwing lesson. Kirin led him out of the hidden sound and into the forest, where he found a tree he liked, took Naruto to a spot 140 feet away, and told him to try and cut the tree in half. Naruto failed miserably the first few times, missing the tree or just nicking it, but on the 9th try, he felt that familiar tug that meant Kirite, or more specifically Kyuubi, wanted chakra. He gave the sword some chakra as he released the throw, and the sword not only cut through the tree perfectly, it also curved around and returned to Naruto's hand. He grinned. The demon could control it using chakra. Kirin was taken slightly aback. "Okay then, I guess it's on to lesson 2. Lesson 2 was learning the Shuriken Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, a skill Kirin claimed was necessary. Due to his experience with the regular variant, applying it to a weapon wasn't very hard and Naruto picked it up quickly. The only thing was that Naruto called it the Kirite Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, since he claimed calling his sword a shuriken was insulting. The rest of the morning revealed that Kyuubi could control 9 swords at once, the original and 8 shadow clones, all of which he delightedly used to reduce a rather large section of the forest to stumps. By 3 o'clock, Kirin was out of things to teach. He wasn't really a ninja after all, and declared that Naruto could go. Naruto rushed back town. The operation would start in 4 days and he needed to be ready. The plan he had concocted with the two Akatsuki was simple. Naruto was going to invade the Sound. Not for real, of course, but enough confusion would be generated and destruction caused that Hoshigaki Kirin's death would be easily overlooked. The problem had been how to make Naruto look like an invading army, but with careful planning, they had come up with an idea that would work and that, over the next 3 days, Naruto started to put into effect. The first thing he did was pose as a simple workman carrying a bag of fertilizer. What no one noticed was that the bag had a hole, and everywhere he walked some fell out. What people didn't know was that there was gunpowder in the bag, not fertilizer. Kirin lived near the south gate, and Naruto, over the course of almost 2 days, had enough gunpowder just laying everywhere in the area like dust that the slightest spark would cause some to ignite, but people just passed it off as lighter malfunctions. He switched from workman to repairman and spent the last day setting up shuriken launchers on the tops of houses so that, when triggered, they would shoot the kunai into the air and make them fall in the street looking as though they had been thrown over the houses. Right before going to sleep the night before the mission, Naruto sat and thought, making sure he hadn't missed a part of the plan. The next morning he would wake up at dawn and start his mock attack an hour later. Naruto was going to instigate his invasion using as many shadow clones as he could make, all using hench to look like various leaf nins. Kisame and Itachi would disguise themselves as sound nins and remove Kirin from his house before torching it. They weren't planning on being in the village more than 15 minutes. 8.5 hours from the Sound, Kisame detected what felt like a very large number of approaching chakra sources and quickly woke his partner. 9 hours from the Sound, Temari led her advance team. Their job was to cover the north gate, so they would have to travel around the whole village to get to their positions, and they had to do it without alerting any sound sentries. 9.5 hours from the hidden Sound, Tsunade was leading the main invasion force. They would rest a short while an hour from the village and attack at dawn. Half an hour before dawn, Naruto was knocked off of Kirin's couch, where he had been sleeping, to see Kisame and Itachi above him, disguised and looking like sound nins. He glanced at the clock. What's wrong? A leaf invasion force will be here in 10 minutes. Itachi said, as if talking about the weather. Naruto looked confused for a moment. A real one? Itachi nodded. Shit, Naruto muttered, this will be a pain, won't it? Itachi nodded again. Kisame left to wake his brother and Naruto got off the couch and started to dress as he talked, so we'll have to fight our way out? Which way? Itachi thought for a moment. North. Assuming that you have everything set up for our plan, the first fire jutsu used in this area of town will light this place up, so we need to get out of the south end before the leaf arrive in. Itachi calmly pulled out a stick of strawberry pocky as he checked his watch. 7 minutes. Kisame ran back into the room, carrying a rather annoyed Kirin over his shoulder. Kirin's eyes widened as he saw Naruto with Itachi, but he quickly understood. All three ran out the back and leapt onto the roof. Hidden Sound was in chaos, people running everywhere making last-minute defense preparations. All three moved their hands through seals and for one instant, every eye in Hidden Sound was facing in their direction as together, they called, Kirigakure no Jutsu. The mist started to form. Between the three of them, there had been more chakra put into the mist than was required to summon 8 Gamabuntas, and soon, all of Hidden Sound and surrounding area was enshrouded with it. Kisame set his brother down and he and Naruto, in somewhat creepy synchronization, drew their swords and flicked off their wrappings. Both Akatsuki raised their eyebrows at Naruto's black engraved blade, but decided to question Kirin later. Naruto reached into his pocket and carefully tied on his forehead protector, taking time to run his hands over the kanji he had scratched in all those weeks ago. He could feel Sirai Kirite pulse with excitement as he looked out into the mist. Without a word, Itachi picked up Kirin and the three shinobi dove into the fog. They ran north silently, each already knowing what they would need to do. At the north gate, Itachi and Kisame would break right and Naruto would continue on. There would be a containment unit of shinobi to stop them from doing exactly what they were doing, and it would be Naruto's responsibility to distract them. There could be no knowledge of Akatsuki, and with the leaf being the attackers, the danger of discovery was even more than usual. They got to the north gate without trouble. Everyone else was heading south to fight. Just as they were arriving, they saw and heard a huge explosion on the south side of town. Both armies would be completely confused at this point. As expected, Naruto watched as Itachi took a sharp right turn just outside the gate. Naruto stopped atop the gate and looked out into the mist-filled forest. Everything he had done since he left his village was for this moment, to look out over what would soon be a battlefield, and not as a Konoha Gennin or even as a Konoha Nukenin, but as Fushigi Naruto. His face widened into a dark grin. Then again, he thought, to his opponents, he would be nothing more than a demonic mirage. Akimichi Chuji looked cautiously into the mist. He had used his multi-size no jutsu as soon as this unnatural fog had rolled in. Less than 40 feet away, Naruto was cursing silently. He knew it was soft, but he really didn't want to kill those few people who had been relatively nice to him. He hefted the eager sword and sent it a clear message. No killing unless Naruto said so. The sword pulsed in his hand and he pulled back his arm and threw. Chuji felt something coming and dove out of the way as it flew past him. It had looked like a huge sword. He was immediately on full alert, looking for something, anything, that would reveal his opponent's location. He lurched once, then twice more as he turned in horror to see 3 huge blades protruding from his back, each of which turned to smoke a moment later. The large man managed to let out a yell before he fell to his knees and passed out, returning to his normal size. Naruto was already running past him to the next opponent. He knew the leaf containment unit formation, he had practiced it many times himself. Yamanaka Ino knew nothing. Naruto was less than 5 feet away from her and she couldn't sense him. He circled her until he was behind her, and calmly, with a shallow slice, he severed her spinal cord near her waist and watched her collapse like a broken puppet. She would never walk again, but he figured he was saving her from a grisly death in combat. She was a crappy shinobi. Now there was only one more. This was where he was going to take a risk, but he really didn't want the 3 dead. He jumped to where the 3rd member should be posted, and as expected, he suddenly felt his body freeze. He knew Shikamaru was somewhere in the mist. He had been sure the genius would find some way to catch him in a shadow bind even without seeing him. This was where it became dangerous. He sent a pulse of chakra to the sword. It sent back a feeling of understanding. He opened the floodgates, pouring demonic chakra into the blade. The blade's aura turned into a giant claw that shot off into the darkness. Naruto heard a grunt and the shadow bind was released. Now came the run-like-hell part. Every shinobi within 3 miles would have felt that. Manifesting took an insane amount of chakra, even by Kyuubi's standards. An investigation team would be there in minutes. He hoped it would be from the leaf, but there was one problem. Naruto didn't know it, but he had only practiced containment operations with 3 people because that's how many were on his team. In the field, it was custom to have a 4th member, farther out. It was for this reason that it caught Naruto rather off guard when a hurricane force wind blasted him up against a tree. He quickly recovered, but found himself in a now mistless clearing facing someone he immediately knew he would lose to. Between the huge Kirigakure no Jutsu and the Kyuubi's manifestation, he was drained of chakra. But more important was that despite the fact that he didn't even remember her name, he couldn't hurt Gaara's sister. He owed far too much to the sleepless boy. Temari was bringing her fan around for a second blast when her blood froze. As Itachi had taught him, Naruto did not force it, he simply allowed his body to flow into what the Sharingan master had called the death stance. Naruto recognized it as what Orochimaru had used in the forest, a collection of fear stimulus that gave the target a paralyzing terror and a feeling of their impending doom. She had seen him, and was working with the leaf. He couldn't afford to let her tell anyone about him. His death stance wasn't very strong yet, and would start to wear off after just a few seconds. Naruto made a decision. He had no time now. He would think of something later. Temari fought to regain control of her body. Logically, she knew she was helpless like this, but the fear was still too strong. Suddenly, Naruto sprung into action, crossing the clearing of sliced trees between them in less than 3 seconds. The last thing Temari saw was a set of demonic eyes burning into her own. Naruto tossed the unconscious girl over his shoulder and glanced back at the mayhem behind him one last time before running as fast as he could into the forest. Long since forgotten, the remains of Naruto's bag lay in the smoldering pile of wood that had once been Kirin's house, where in a few short hours, a certain long-haired Hyuga would notice a necklace glinting in the sunlight. Chapter 10, Camping with Your Captor. Naruto giggled. He knew it really wasn't the time, but he couldn't help it. His companion was so cute. The 12-inch tall fox glared balefully at him. They were in Naruto's mindscape, standing before the sealed gate, and the miniature fox was getting very annoyed. He momentarily considered biting the boy's ankle, but decided that would just be demeaning himself. What they saw through the gate was an odd sight, looking something like a sunset. The demon's chakra simply sat there, behind the seal, a sea of red energy. Naruto sighed. He had been hoping there might be a way to draw on this ocean of chakra, but with the fox now on his side of the seal, there was no one to push it through, so the chakra just slowly leaked out. As a consolation prize, he got to annoy a tiny demon fox. Within the mindscape, the demon's form was maintained by his chakra, so without it he reverted to the smallest and most efficient form possible. It also made him hilariously cute. Needless to say, the demon wasn't appreciating the humor. In what had hours ago been the hidden sound, the fifth Hokage surveyed the destruction around her. Lives had been lost, sacrifices made, but Orochimaru was dead. She turned and walked back into the temporary hospital, and started to tend to the ever-arriving wounded. With the death of their leader, the majority of the Soundnines had immediately given themselves up. Unfortunately, there had been no sign of Sasuke, but it had been a perfectly orchestrated invasion. Except for two things. The first was the odd disturbance at the northern gate. 3 shinobi had been badly injured, 1 was still missing, but none killed. She had examined them herself. The wounds on both Shikamaru and Chuji were from an unknown source, but Ino looked to have been cut once across the back with some large sharp object. It wasn't a cut designed to kill, too shallow, and it showed too much forethought to be an accident. Chuji had 3 deep gashes in his back and Shikamaru looked to have had his arm almost torn off by some huge hand, but these wounds too were non-lethal. Whoever attacked them had been holding back. She was waiting for one of the 3 to regain consciousness and give her a better picture of what happened, as Gaara had been very restless since the news of his sister's disappearance. The other problem, and honestly, the one really bothering the Hokage, was the discovery of the necklace. Hyuga Neji was in the hospital with a rather bad case of chakra burn from using Kaiten too much, and had mentioned in passing that he had found a necklace that looked exactly like the one Naruto used to wear. Now, when Hyuga Neji said, exactly like, he didn't mean really similar to, like most people did, he meant exactly like. Tsunade had immediately demanded he show it to her, and he had. It was the same necklace. Somehow, weeks after his death, Naruto's necklace was showing up in the hidden sound. Something wasn't adding up. Tsunade wasn't sure what it was yet, but it was there, that nagging feeling that she'd missed something. She was broken out of her thoughts as a group of civilians were brought in. They had been in a building crushed by Manda. Temari was floating. Her body was weightless, surrounded by nothingness. Sight showed nothing but blackness. Ears heard nothing but cursing. Temari slowly opened her eyes, blinking into what felt like very bright light. Once she was mostly aware and started to take some notice of her surroundings, she realized she was sitting, leaning against something and couldn't move her arms. She was now waking up very quickly. Abruptly, the cursing she had been hearing stopped, and her eyes finally focused just in time to see a set of dark red eyes looking into hers. Suddenly, she remembered. She had lost in the forest, but then, her eyes widened in fear. There was only one reason to keep a shinobi alive and awake. Torture them for information. In a panic, Temari desperately tried to bite off her tongue, but suddenly felt a hand shoved into her mouth, so she bit it instead. Naruto grimaced. He knew what her initial reaction would be, but still, his hand was in a world of pain. He grabbed her head with his other hand and forced her to look at him again. First thing, Naruto said in a rather strained voice, I am not going to torture, kill, violate, abuse or harm you, so for the love of God stop biting my hand. Temari dug her teeth in for another second, and then let go, glaring at who she now realized was her captor. Naruto shook his hand to get the blood flowing again, then smiled politely at the struggling girl. My name is Fushashu Naruto, and yours is? Temari glared, screw you. Naruto's polite smile turned into a grin as he raised his sword and brought it down sharply. Temari screamed. He stopped the blade less than an inch above her head. Tears started to form in the corners of her eyes. Bastard, Temari growled. Your name? Naruto said, his grin still in place. Temari, she spat her name at him, like it was a curse. Naruto considered this for a moment, and then nodded before turning and walking into the woods. Don't go anywhere, Temari-san. He called over his shoulder. Once he was out of her line of sight, Naruto collapsed against a tree. He had never, in all his years as a shinobi, been the one in control. He had always been someone's subordinate. For the first time ever, he was calling the shots and it scared him senseless. He knew the act like Kisame trick wouldn't hold up for long. He wasn't that good at being mean. And anyway, the girl had already seen too much of him for releasing her to be an option, so he would have to keep her nearby until he thought of something else. Naruto resisted the urge to start cursing again. Now alone, Temari took time to more carefully examine her position. She was sitting on the ground with her back against a tree and her hands were bound behind her. She noticed a moment later that her hair was loose, and pondered this before she tried to move her hands again. The bastard had bound her with her own hair ties. Her fan was also nowhere in sight, something that bothered her greatly as she was almost useless in a fight without it. Just as quickly as he had left, the bastard, as she now referred to him, walked back into her line of sight. Temari decided that she should start the conversation this time. "I really hate you," she said, using her most menacing tone. To her astonishment and indignation, the bastard started to laugh at her. 30 seconds later, he was still laughing and Temari was thinking he'd maybe lost his mind when he finally calmed down and managed to respond. "You hate me?" Naruto said between giggles. "Listen, little girl, there are a very large number of people in this world who hate me, and pretty much all of them are more frightening than you. Hell, I'm more afraid of my sword than I am of you." It was a minor point that Naruto was actually 3 years younger than the Sannin, but she didn't need to know that. Naruto suddenly became serious, "But all that is really unimportant. What is important is that right now, you are in my control, and you are also very pissed off about it." Not getting any feedback, Naruto continued on, "I'm going to give you a hypothetical situation, and you need to tell me what you do, agreed?" Temari glared. Naruto took that as a yes. "You," he said, "are a missing nin, one who has protected their identity so well. There are 3 people in the world who know who you are. Then one day, an enemy sees you, someone who could identify you. Normally you'd kill them, but something is preventing you from doing so. What options are left over?" Temari had long since figured out where this was going, and didn't like the answer she was coming to. Seeing she understood his point either way, approached her while continuing to speak. "So as you can see, there's no point in being angry at me since I have no more control of the situation than you do. I can't kill you and I can't let you go, so now that we understand each other." He cut through her bindings. Within half a second, Temari had a hidden kunai in her hand and was getting ready to stab. A half second later, she was on the ground, her arm twisted around backwards and the kunai now pointed at the back of her neck. "Temari-san, we will probably have to put up with each other for a while, so please don't do that," Naruto said while removing his sword from his back and placing it next to her. "I need to go hunt for something to eat. You may move 20 feet in any direction, but no further, and must always have this sword right next to you." He then released her arm and casually walked off into the forest. As was expected, within moments he felt the sword sending him an image of Temari getting ready to run. So Naruto sent back an image of Temari restrained by fox claws, along with what remained of his chakra. Temari almost screamed again. When she was about to run, the sword grew clawed arms and grabbed hold of her. Naruto walked back into the clearing. "One more thing, Temari-san, the sword is intelligent." He paused, "But I see you've already learned that." He again walked into the forest. Temari lay on the forest floor staring at the darkening sky, her arms stretched out and the sword lying silently next to her. "You know," she said to it, "I've always thought of myself as somewhat of an authority on weird homicidal shinobi, but this guy is something else." She sighed. 24 hours ago I was preparing for a minor role in an invasion. Now, my team is probably dead. I'm in a forest somewhere, prisoner of a demon-eyed boy who manages to be polite and terrifying at the same time, and being guarded by a sword." Amazingly, the sword remained silent. "It's like I'm living a twisted nightmare." Temari rested a hand on her forehead as she felt a breeze, but suddenly jumped upright as she heard a voice behind her. "Is it really that bad? I know that slitted red eyes thing throws people off, but I think terrifying is a little strong." "And," he said, drawing the word out, "I'll have you know that not a single one of your minions is dead, though I did cripple the blonde one." Temari glared yet again as Naruto grinned at her. "So what are we having to eat exactly?" Temari asked annoyedly. She really was hungry. "One dead rabbit and 1 box of double chocolate Pocky," Naruto said as he grinned wider and held out both hands. Temari just hung her head. The boy was crazy. He had to be. She would laugh herself silly at him if he couldn't kick her ass so efficiently. Come to think of it, even his sword had immobilized her without much effort. She wasn't even as strong as his weapon. It was these types of uplifting thoughts that occupied Temari while Naruto set up a fire and started to cook the rabbit. Food was eaten quickly and both were tired, so going to sleep early was the first thing they agreed on all day. Temari had the sword next to her, keeping watch as she insisted Naruto stay a decent distance away even though they were just lying on the ground with their clothes on. They both soon started to drift, but Temari regained her senses enough to ask the drowsy Naruto a question. "In that hypothetical situation we talked about, why can't I kill the one who saw me?" He looked over at her, and for 1 second, she saw something hidden within his eyes. It was gone in the next moment and he smirked at her. "That's for me to know and you to go crazy wondering about." It was an answer typical of him, but Temari was awake for another half hour wondering about that momentary flicker of depth. The morning after the invasion, Tsunade went outside to watch the sun rise. She had been working all night, but their casualties had been far lower than expected. Gaara was already outside. Hida had been awake all night, but it was normal for him. The two stood silently and watched the first rays of light peek over the horizon. Gaara started to speak hesitantly. Hokage-sama, I have a confession to make. Tsunade didn't even turn her head as she spoke. Naruto's alive, isn't he? Gaara nodded. Tsunade felt her hands close into fists. She knew she couldn't fault Gaara. Naruto had been the one to make the choice to leave. She felt blood run out of her hands as her nails dug holes in her skin. Naruto had been here, in this very village. She hoped he had gotten out before the invasion, but couldn't even imagine what would have brought him here in the first place. Either way, she had no choice in what she was about to do. She purposefully strode all the way to where she knew Shizen would be planning diplomatic meetings for when they arrived back in Konoha. Tsunade didn't let herself falter, even once. She interrupted her assistant in the middle of writing a scroll to be sent to the various countries informing them of the Sound's defeat. Shizen, she said, fighting to keep her voice from breaking, as of right now, Uzumaki Naruto is hereby registered as an A-class missing nin, location unknown. Inform the hunters. Tsunade spun, ignoring the shocked look she was getting, and walked out, fighting her tears. Oblivious to his plight, the newly official missing nin was just waking up, feeling extremely refreshed. A night's sleep did wonders for his chakra supply. He glanced over at Temari and confirmed she was still asleep before taking a moment to think. At this point, he had two directions he could travel in, east or west. West would take him almost directly to Hidden Waterfall, but he would still be right above Fire Country. East was a long trip, but would take him to Hidden Cloud, much farther away from and an enemy of Hidden Leaf. East it was. He needed time to decide what to do with the troublesome Sand Nin before he started looking actively for missions, and he had enough money to last a while, though he had lost his extra clothing. Naruto sighed as Temari started to stir. He really wished Itachi were here. His Sharingan could just awe the girl with their coolness and then she would do whatever she was told. That was one trick the Uchiha had never taught him. He felt a tug in his mind, and unconsciously gave a bit of chakra. He immediately heard a shout behind him and spun around to see Temari glaring at Kirite. She turned to Naruto looking livid. Your sword just groped me. What? Temari was raging. A glowing red claw just grabbed my ass. Naruto looked at her skeptically, but then he started to get a feeling of satisfaction from Kyubi. Naruto pinched the bridge of his nose. He really didn't need this first thing in the morning. Okay, you, he pointed to the sword, speaking out loud for Temari's benefit, no manifesting unless there's a reason. And you, he pointed at Temari, don't give him a reason. Temari looked indignant and the sword was oozing smugness. Seeing as both apparently understood, Naruto continued. We're heading east as of now. We have no supplies and it's at least a day and a half to the nearest village. Temari, you are to keep the sword on your back at all times, and must always be within 30 feet of me, otherwise, I'll have you restrained and carry you. Temari suddenly had the feeling that the sword was leering at her. She managed to look furious and slightly embarrassed at the same time. Fine, she muttered, but I need something to tie my hair up with. Why? Naruto immediately asked. 2 reasons, she said annoyedly, it falls in my face, making it hard to see and look stupid. Naruto pondered this for a moment, speaking as someone who has spent his life around whiny girls who spend all say on their appearance. Your hair looks fine, and I'm the only one who can see it anyway. But if you're having trouble seeing, there's always the option of being carried. I'll be fine, she growled. They were soon moving through the forest at a fast pace, Temari wondering the whole time whether the first part of the bastard's last comment had been a compliment or insult. The news that Naruto had been registered as a nuke nin spread like wildfire through the Leaf Camp. It was quickly the most popular topic of gossip in camp. A great number of shinobi were already pushing to have a special squad of hunter nin devoted just to killing the fox boy. Tsunade had known this would happen, but she also knew she couldn't allow her personal feelings to get in the way of what had to be done. She felt a presence behind her and turned to see Yumino Irika standing nervously by the door of her tent. She gestured for him to enter, and he did, bowing quickly. Hokage-sama, I've been hearing some. The brown-haired Chunin paused, unsettling rumors around camp and wanted to confirm them with you. Is it true that you registered Naruto as a missing nin? Tsunade nodded. It now appears that he faked his own death to cover his betrayal. She finished sadly. Irika looked at the ground sadly. In that case, Hokage-sama, there's something I'd like to give you. I want you to seriously consider it, please. He handed her a piece of paper before running out of the tent. Tsunade looked at what he had given her and her eyes widened. It was an application to join the Hunter Nin. Chapter 11, Not Quite Checkmate. Once again, Naruto found himself in a rather difficult situation. They had made decent time and were now only an hour or two away from a small town on the border of Sound Country. Temari had been thankfully quiet for the latest part of their journey, as Naruto needed to come up with some way to control her within the town. Glowing red arms grabbing onto people was the kind of attention he didn't want, so he would have to be subtler in populated areas. He knew that constant physical contact was out of the question. They both needed clean clothing and a bath. His answer came in form of an image from Kyubi. Naruto knew the sand girl wouldn't like it, but that was probably why the demon had suggested it. He held up a hand and the two shinobi stopped, landing on the ground almost in unison. Temari turned to him with a glare, as he noted she always seemed to do. This meant she was at least less afraid of him now, though whether that was good or bad he couldn't decide. Why are we stopping so close to a village? The irate girl demanded to know. As I'm sure you know, Naruto said, it will be more difficult to watch you once we're in town. Temari had known that for days. She was counting on it and would be looking for a chance to escape. And you also know, he continued, that my normal methods of restraining you won't work. So, with help from Kirite, I have come up with a solution. Naruto walked over to the girl, took the sword of her back and with a flick of a kunai, cut a small hole in her clothes right above her waist. She of course, had something to say about this. What the hell do you think you're doing? Naruto grabbed her arm and calmly replaced the sword on her back, covering the hole. This way, he said, if you cause problems, the manifested restraints can go under your clothing. At this point, Naruto wasn't sure if she was red from embarrassment or anger. There is, of course, another option, but I didn't think you'd go for having to hold my hand 24/7. And if you don't try to run or kill me, it won't be a problem either way. The unfortunate thing was that she had been planning on trying to escape or kill him, or more likely both. Temari knew she had lost this battle, but she was determined to win the war. He would have to slip up eventually, she would be there when he did. The two shinobi jumped back into the trees and went on their way. They arrived in town rather late, so Naruto led his rebellious but tired prisoner to one of the first good hotels he saw. He could afford it, and they had been sleeping on the ground for 2 nights. He got a regular 2-bedroom and quickly dragged Temari upstairs. Their odd appearance and gigantic sword had been drawing attention. Once inside, Naruto set down some rules. Okay, your leaving this room requires one of 2 things, either you're with me, or you've told me where you're going and you take Kirite. Temari got annoyed, this place had public baths, or am I supposed to just not wash myself? Naruto did a few hand seals. One cloud of smoke later, he was a dark-haired girl. He had modified his usual sexy no jutsu to include clothes. He grinned. Me or the sword, your pick. Temari had a choice between an annoying boy and a creepy sword. The sword didn't talk. She took Kirite. Temari slid into the water still holding onto the sword. The bathing area was empty and she didn't want to give the blade any chance to restrain her while she was unclothed. Once she was settled, she held the sword up out of the water. She had never actually spent much time looking at it before. The handle was ordinary, but that was where normalcy ended. The blade reflected almost no light at all, no matter how she angled it. She moved on to the etching. It amazed her even now, both sides were carved in a mirror image of each other. The carving was perfect, the 2 great monsters locked in combat truly looked alive. She started at the hilt, where the fox's tail started, and slowly ran her hand across the engraved image. Near the middle of the blade, the fox and dragon twisted around each other, both trying to land a fatal blow. The scene was obviously near the end of a battle, but Temari realized with the start that no one would ever know which one won the fight. The two would be forever frozen in the moment right before the victor was decided. Temari realized that she had never asked how or why the sword was sentient, she just accepted it. After all, her little brother carried intelligent sand around with him, so who was she to question an intelligent sword? But now she was curious. She sank deeper into the warm water and decided to ask him about it later. Back in the room, Naruto was smacking himself in the head. Naruto had been working over a map, planning their route to and through Lightning Country, when the Kyubi had decided it would be fun to send random pictures of a wet Temari directly into Naruto's mind every few seconds. The demon was careful to make sure each image was at an angle such that it suggested everything and revealed nothing. Kyubi grinned to himself within the sword. This was fun. He had never had the chance to do things like this before and it was a novel experience. Hell, He though as Naruto started banging his head on the table, terrorizing these two was almost as much fun as obliterating a village. Almost. Temari arrived back at their room an hour later, wrapped in a towel and carrying her clothes. Naruto didn't even glance up from where he was laying on his bed. He knew he would blush if he did. Temari washed her clothes in the bathroom, as Naruto had done while she was bathing. She had spent enough time with her captor to know something weird was going on when he was quiet for this long. She estimated that he should have made at least 3 wisecracks by now. She emerged from the bathroom a short time later still wrapped in her towel, but Naruto could see as he glanced over that she was wearing her net shirt under it. Unlike the fox boy, she crawled under the covers of her bed. Temari stared at the ceiling for a few moments, but quickly found herself drifting off. She was awakened sometime later, but a silent glance at the clock showed it to be only 2 a.m. A lamp was on in the room, and a moment later Temari noticed Naruto sitting at the table in the corner. Sasuke was leaning against the other side of the table and Naruto was studying something on top. "Are you aware it's 2 o'clock in the morning?" Temari half murmured. "Yeah." Temari glanced at what he was studying on the table. "Why are you playing chess with yourself?" she asked. "I'm not," came Naruto's reply. "Who are you playing with then?" Temari asked skeptically, but as she finished speaking, a clawed hand reached out of the sword and moved a piece. Temari blinked. "Your sword plays chess?" Naruto nodded. "He's pretty good at it too." "Oh." Temari paused for a moment. "The question I'm leading up to here is why are you playing chess with your sword at 2 a.m.? Naruto took his opponent's knight with one of his bishops. Couldn't sleep. Temari paused again. "Where did you get the chess set?" Kyubi took Naruto's rook with his queen. Stole it from the game room downstairs. Oh. Temari just sat there for a moment. She slowly got out of bed and wrapped a blanket around herself before pulling a chair up to their table and silently watching them play. The boy felt himself drifting in pleasant darkness. There was nothing here, no one to bother him. Suddenly, he heard rather screechy voices surrounding him, and started to notice that his left arm hurt. Shikamaru opened his eyes and sighed. Troublesome. The moment Tsunade heard Shikamaru was awake, she insisted all others leave the room so she could debrief him personally. She sat next to his bed on a foldable chair. "So you're absolutely sure," the Hokage said, "that it was a fox head that bit you?" The shadow user nodded slowly. "Yes, a red fox head. It appeared to be a chakra manifestation." Tsunade was impressed, but Shikamaru was both the laziest and most observant person she knew, so if he said it had been a fox, it had been a fox. She knew what that meant. She slowly walked out of the room and turned to the waiting Shizun. "Naruto's status is now upgraded, he is now an S-class missing nin. He was the one who attacked the northern gate. Kyubi is active enough to manifest. I want the best hunter nin and ANBU we have on this. The demon cannot be allowed to break loose." The great irony of course being that at that moment in time, the great demon fox was about as dangerous as a house cat without Naruto to give him chakra. Currently, Naruto was quite contentedly snoring in bed. Temari had woken up first and was already dressed. She had momentarily considered making a break for the door, but Sasuke's presence mocked her, as if daring her to run. She looked at the sword again and out of sheer curiosity, started to count the tails on the fox. She had known there were more than 6, but never actually counted. 7, 8, 9 tails, a 9-tailed fox. Something tickled in Temari's memory, a connection she had missed and couldn't get a hold of. She looked around the room and saw Naruto's wallet sitting on the table. It was a frog. Her eyes widened. "Gaara." The girl pinned against the tree. Gaara transformed. The frog. The fox. Uzumaki Naruto. He must have left his village only a short time after she last saw him, after the failed rescue of Uchiha Sasuke. Almost everything about him had changed, but she was sure it was him all the same. This was the boy who had beaten her brother. The one who was supposed to be dead. Temari suddenly thought of his new name. Fushashu Naruto. One who was burned alive and reborn from the ashes of his demise. Of all her revelations, it was this one that stayed with her as she watched him awake. Naruto knew something was wrong the moment he woke up. Temari sitting on a chair near the end of his bed and was looking at him thoughtfully. She had never done that before. "I want you to promise to answer a question truthfully," the sand girl said carefully. Sensing humor wouldn't be appreciated right now, Naruto just nodded. Temari took a deep breath. How did Uzumaki Naruto really die? Of all the questions in the world, that had been the one Naruto had been least expecting, but it was at least, he thought sadly, one he knew the answer to. "He died," the boy said with a dark smile. from broken dreams and a broken heart. The both sat in silence for a few minutes, then Naruto quietly got out of bed, put his vest and shoes on, and slid Kirite into place on his back. He walked to the door of their room and stopped. Temari stood up, put on her shoes, and they walked out the door together. Temari would later wonder what might have happened had she not followed him that day. But, she would then amend, it hadn't really been her decision. In that moment, whatever fear or desire to escape she had was overcome by a need to understand. And so she followed. Irika stared into the mirror and the white mask that stared back. The decision to don the mask had been easy. Irika knew Naruto better than anyone, so no one would be a better choice for hunting the boy down. The problems would arise, he knew, when he did find the boy. What was he going to do? Ask the boy to come back? As much as Irika hated to admit it, Naruto had engineered and executed an almost perfect fake death, one that had fooled the whole village for weeks. The problem was, that kind of planning was proof that his leaving had been premeditated, and not just spontaneous. There was no leniency in the law when it came to that type of treason. A shinobi who left the village in a way that suggested it had been planned was to be killed on sight. Irika didn't think he could live with that. He had to talk to Naruto first. The brown-haired man carefully removed his new mask and massaged his face. He would wait and decide what to do when he saw Naruto. Gaara wasn't sure what to think. The news that Temari had disappeared in an attack by Naruto was both comforting and disturbing at the same time. Gaara was sure Naruto wouldn't hurt his sister, but that really didn't make the thought of his sister being held captive by a nuke even Naruto, more likable. Kankuro hadn't taken it nearly so well, and had gone to vent his anger on some trees. Gaara stared up at the sky. He and Kankuro had been called back to Hidden Sand alone with the rest of the Sand Nins. They would leave the next day. The sand swirled around him anxiously. He hated to leave without Temari, but she could be anywhere. He would have to trust Naruto to take care of her, and for the fox boy's sake, he better be trustworthy. Hiroshi ran through the forest, surrounded by his squad. The Hokage had deployed them 10 hours before. She had mobilized more than half the hunter nin for this. Squads were sent to all nearby towns, told they were hunting an S-class criminal named Uzumaki. Everyone, of course, knew what that meant. The demon child. As an added bonus, Hiroshi had heard that he had taken a sand girl along with him. Hiroshi had lost his brother to the war with the sand and figured that if his squad found them, he might have to engineer a little accident involving the sand nin. Currently, the aforementioned Sans nin was shopping. It hadn't taken her 30 seconds after leaving the hotel to realize that the sword no longer covered the hole Naruto had made in her clothing. Naruto was now carrying his sword, as there wouldn't be any need to restrain her. They had come to a kind of unspoken understanding. She knew enough now that if she ran, he would probably be forced to hunt her down and kill her. She knew he really didn't want to do that, and she didn't really want to die. They both knew she wouldn't run, and so she was now looking for new clothes. Naruto had given her 15,000 yen to spend, mostly, as she liked, and had gone off to buy traveling supplies. Temari had never been a shopping person, primarily because she always wore the same thing, but Naruto had insisted she get some pants and at least one regular shirt. She had growled for a little while, as she was very fond of her net shirts, but complied anyway. He was the one paying, after all. Naruto arrived back an hour later to see Temari looking rather stressed, but holding a shopping bag of clothes. Naruto himself was carrying a large duffel. Once they arrived back at the room, Naruto opened the bag and started pulling out its contents one by one, naming them as he went. Some new pants to replace the pair I lost, 2 extra light sleeping bags, new underwear, magnetic chess set, whetstone, dehydrated soup, a pot, pocky, soap, oh, and he pulled out a small package and threw them to her with a smirk, new hair ties. Temari glared, but it was half-hearted. Things were still slightly awkward between them. Temari had accepted that trying to escape was pointless. Eventually, she knew Naruto would let her go, but it still felt somehow wrong to be acting like the two of them were just two shinobi on a mission, when she technically was his prisoner. Naruto was getting nervous. She was looking at him thoughtfully again. The boy got refocused when he thought of the plan he had made the evening before. He pulled out his map and laid it out on table. This, he said, pointing to a small dot on the eastern border on Sound Country, is where we are now. Naruto went on to describe the approximate location of Hidden Cloud and the path they would have to travel to get there, but it was the end of his speech that made Temari jump. And when we arrive, I'm going to let you go. The boy finished, my village will figure out my secrets soon anyway, and the cloud has no hostilities with the sand, so you should be able to find your way home. Things didn't seem so bad all of a sudden. Temari now had a goal to work towards. It would be a week at least to Hidden Cloud, but it meant that she could be home in the sand within the month. Temari would have liked to leave that moment, but Naruto wanted to take a bath himself, which he had neglected to do the day before, and eat a meal in town, as it would be 2 days to the next one. The two paid the hotel manager and left right after dinner. Temari got to carry the duffel since Naruto had his sword to haul around, but she complained about it regularly, just to annoy him. The Nukenin and his prisoner were almost to the edge of town when they passed a small sushi shop. Above them on the roof, Hiroshi smiled as he looked at the picture in his hand. It was his lucky day. Naruto felt his shinobi sense tingling as soon as he passed the sushi shop, so it was with relative calmness that he shoved Temari into an alley, drew his sword and spun to deflect some needles aimed at his neck in one smooth motion. There were 6 hunters that he could see, and there would be one spotter somewhere. Naruto ran down the street, staying close to the buildings. Even hunters couldn't throw jutsus around in populated areas. He leaped into the air and spun, releasing Kirite, before landing and running along a building wall while flashing through seals. The hunters scattered as the huge sword sailed past them, but failed to notice when it split into 9. Naruto jumped off the wall, landing on the ground just in time to catch his sword and go into a spinning slice, dispatching a hunter who had tried to get into close combat. A second hunter came at him from behind, while the other 3 tried to hit a vital point with their needles. Naruto snorted, these weaklings had nothing on Haku. He spun again, deflecting the needles with the flat of the blade and bringing it around to face the hunter who had tried to attack his rear. Kirite flashed again, the second hunter fell. Apart from a few needles in uncomfortable places, Naruto was uninjured. 3 hunters faced him in the street, deciding how they should attack. He never gave them a chance. He let his body flow into the death stance and watched them freeze up in terror. They would be able to fight it off in a few seconds. Kyubi didn't need half that much time. The sword's shadow clones came from behind, as they had with Chuji. Without the added bulk of multi-size no jutsu, none of them stood a chance. Various pieces of hunter-nin lay in the street, but Naruto wasn't paying attention. There had been 6. Where was the last one? He spun with a growl and ran back towards the alley. To say that Temari was shocked would be an understatement. She sat in the darkness between the 2 buildings with mixed feelings. She knew the presence of the hunter-nin meant she was safe and could go home, but there was a part of her that would mourn the death of the odd boy she had spent 4 days with. A leaf hunter-nin landed in front of her and offered her a hand getting up. She smiled sadly as she reached for it, but then noticed a glint in his other hand. Her eyes widened, the hunter was concealing a knife and slowly drawing the arm back for a stab. It's a common misconception that in the game of chess, a player wins when he kills the opponent's king. In reality, a player wins when his opponent's king is put in such a position where, no matter what he does, he dies. Temari had one more move. Naruto arrived just in time to see Temari trip the final hunter and slam a kunai into his face. The mask split, revealing the man's face just long enough for him to whisper, "Sand bitch," and fall, blood oozing around the knife sticking out of his forehead. Naruto rushed to catch Temari as she collapsed. She had just killed a leaf hunter, one sent to kill a Nukenin she was traveling with. Right now the spotter for the squad was rushing back to inform his superiors of what happened. Within 24 hours, she would be labeled as a missing nin. Hours ago she had been looking forward to seeing her village in under a month. She would probably never see her village again. But she was alive. There was nothing Naruto could say, so he just sat, soaked in blood, and held her as she sobbed. Chapter 12, Culinary Philosophy. Temari sat up against a tree, her arms wrapped around her legs and her eyes staring off into space. Naruto was starting a fire to cook a dehydrated rice dish he had picked up. Both were in an odd state. They had been running for 16 hours, and had been up for more than 24. Despite that, neither felt like sleeping. After finally getting the fire started, Naruto walked over and sat against the tree next to Temari. He grabbed a stick of Pocky out of the package he kept in one of his shuriken holsters and started to slowly munch. "Did you know," he asked the girl, "that I once ate fried rice made by the 3rd Hokage?" Temari was silent. "I've since then discovered," he continued, "that much of a person's personality is defined by the food they eat. The 3rd liked fried rice, which is basically made up of things that are healthy, but is fried in oil to make it just a little bit sinful." Temari turned to look at him slightly as he went on. "Irika, who you don't know, always ate ramen with me at a stand. Ramen is cheap, warm and filling." Irika was always like that, never wanting anything in return for the kindness he showed everyone. Temari now had most of her attention focused on Naruto's words. Then, Naruto held up his snack. We have Pocky, an inherent contradiction. A pretzel stick, covered in chocolate. These two sides make it almost impossible to define. It is neither good nor bad for you, neither sweet nor salty, it is ambiguous, it just is. Naruto took another bite. The first person I ate Pocky with was a psychopath who murdered his family. He was also the person who taught me the skills that saved both our lives. These two sides seem impossible to reconcile, until you stop thinking in terms of good and evil. Naruto finished his stick and grabbed another. Yesterday, I killed 5 people from my old village in less than 60 seconds, but I needed to do it for us to survive. I don't think of myself as good or evil. I, like Pocky, just continue to exist. Naruto took his Pocky out of his holster and set it on the ground before standing up and going over to check on the fire. Temari slowly reached and took a stick out of the open pack. She set her head on her knees as she took a bite, smiling ever so slightly. Tsunade was tense. The camp was being packed and the shinobi were getting ready to head back to Konoha, and this meant making arrangements for all the wounded, making sure they had a way to get home. Shizen rushed up to her. Hokage-sama, we have another problem with Yamanaka Ino. Tsunade sighed. What this time? She was disturbing the other patients again. So? She does that constantly. She was explaining to another patient how horrible it was to try and find anything that looked fashionable in a wheelchair. And the patient she was explaining this to had his face horribly scarred and both his eyes burned out by a fire jutsu. He apparently had a small mental breakdown after listening to her for 20 minutes. Tsunade swore, have a Chunin watch her constantly, that girl has less tact than Jiraiya in a bathhouse. Shizen rushed off just as another shinobi rushed up carrying a scroll, which Tsunade snatched and started to read. Her face went white as a sheet. Gaara and Kankuro were just preparing to leave when a leaf Chunin ran up to them and whispered something in Gaara's ear. Our sister's been what? Gaara bellowed, causing every breathing being within 60 feet to freeze. Gaara was really fighting the urge to squish someone right now. He stormed through the camp, his sand spinning around him, picking up random things and flinging them around. He looked rather like a sand tornado. His storm was normally limited to picking up non-living things. Tents, chairs, packed boxes of this or that, but it also picked up the odd shinobi or small child, and most were rather displeased with being flung in random directions. He figured the Hokage would get complaints later, but really didn't care. Surprisingly, Kankuro was also fighting the urge to squish someone. He almost started setting off poison bombs the moment Gaara had told him. Though not as impressive as his younger brother, Kankuro was pissed as hell, and was following in Gaara's wake. Tsunade suddenly found herself exposed as a walking sandstorm disintegrated her tent. Can I help you? The Hokage asked politely. Instead of squishing her, he settled for his most menacing glare. Why has my sister been registered as a missing nin? Tsunade was getting nervous. She was reported to have killed one of the hunter nin sent to find Naruto. The whole squad less one was wiped out. Gaara continued to glare, and therefore, the last member must be the one who told you these lies about Temari. Tsunade was starting to squirm. Until I learn otherwise, I have to assume he's telling the truth. The sand started to swirl more violently and Kankuro stepped forward to back his little brother up if he needed it. Kakashi calmly walked between the Hokage and the demon boy, reading his porn book and laughing to himself, completely immune to the tension. The eyes of over 60 onlookers watched the copy ninja as he wandered off again, completely ignorant. Gaara growled. Kakashi had killed the mood. He spun on his heels, calling over his shoulder, no sand hunters will pursue her, I will see to that. If you want to throw away the lives of your shinobi, Gaara grinned, feel free. The sand user stomped away, wishing he was half as confident as he sounded. Temari didn't even have her fan, which meant she'd be mostly useless in any difficult fight. He was hoping his confidence might have thrown the Hokage off for a little while, but knew that even if his ploy worked, it wouldn't for long. Soon she would deploy the hunter nin again. Gaara had limited power, but he could stop the sand hunters and he could, and would, make the Hokage's life as difficult as possible. He needed to talk to Baki. The Hokage had sent the hunter's report to Irika before she sent the messenger to Gaara and now strode purposefully into his tent to see what he thought. She then strode purposefully back out, blushing slightly, as she had walked in on him changing. A minute later, Irika blushingly invited her in, but things soon turned serious. Hokage-sama, the Chunin began, before anything else, you must first promise that you will not send any other hunter squads to be slaughtered without consulting me. Tsunade raised an eyebrow at his presumptuousness, but nodded. We have unfortunately, Iruka continued, put Naruto in his most dangerous state. In taking the sand girl, he took responsibility for her, and now that she's been declared a missing nin, Naruto will blame himself for that too. That unfortunately means that Naruto will do anything to keep her alive. He isn't desperate, but he is ruthless, and no ordinary squad can fight him with any decent hope of victory. Tsunade let the Chunin continue as he shifted gears. The first thing we have to do is clear up some misconceptions. Naruto is incredibly clever, and we can't underestimate him. From the report I read, he killed the hunter nin primarily with taijutsu, and very quickly, so we have no idea what types of ninjutsu he's picked up in his time away. Another point is Naruto's sword. Where did he get it? What does it do? The report talked about the sword splitting into many and acting independently, as if they were controlled. That has to be looked into. Tsunade just stood there as Iruka continued to talk. Next, the idea that Kyuubi is breaking the seal is absurd. If the demon is manifesting, it's to help Naruto fight, but we need to confirm that too. It sounds unlikely. As for the boy's changed appearance, Iruka glanced at the report again. I'll explain that later. Right now, I need you to gather these people. This is the team I'll need. Tsunade ran her eyes down the list and looked slightly shocked. But, this is... Iruka nodded. When we go after Naruto, we need those people, otherwise, it's useless. He dispatched 5 Chunin with only taijutsu. That skill, combined with the mist jutsu he used in the attack on the North Gate, would allow him to fight even a Jounin squad, but I can counter it if you give me the right team. Tsunade turned to leave, but Iruka had one more thing to say. Oh, and Hokage-sama, I'll need the shinobi ID photos for Gaara and Sasuke copied onto clear plastic. Call me when everything is ready. Tsunade glared slightly. You better have one hell of a presentation for us, Iruka. He looked at the ground sadly. Oh, I will. Be sure of that. Naruto and Temari sat around their fire-eating breakfast. Thankfully, both had been able to sleep the night before and were now not quite so tired. Naruto was currently trying to convince Temari that her life wasn't over, and unfortunately for her village loyalty, he was winning the argument. I mean really, the fox boy was saying, how many people in your old village were even decent to you? From what I hear, your life has been training and taking crap from the villagers. Temari didn't say anything since the only comeback she had come up with was that she kind of liked training. I realize that you miss your family, he continued, but I really can't see either of your brothers condemning you for this, and who cares what the rest of the village thinks. Temari was being swayed by his argument, but suddenly glared. There is, she said, the minor issue of spending your life being hunted. Naruto shrugged. Gaara scares the hidden sand way too much for them to hunt you, and as for hidden leaf, they'll give up sooner or later. Sensing she was bending, Naruto went on. Can you even remember the last time you did something fun? And I mean fun in a not killing people kind of way. I understand that you didn't ask for this, but there are many worse fates. Temari snorted. Like what? Naruto smiled. Having a demon inside you. Temari stopped and looked at him for a moment. I really can't argue with that, can I? His smile became a grin. No. She sighed. But even if I went along with being a missing nin, I'd need a new fan. Battle fans are only made in hidden sand, and even then, not many are manufactured. This, Naruto realized, would be a problem. But he had ways of dealing with problems. Wait a sec, he said, I need to consult with someone. Naruto let himself drop into a meditative state and soon found himself in the passages of his mind, the chibi fox already waiting for him. The fox looked absolutely ecstatic, and Naruto wasn't sure if this was good or bad. Kyuubi got straight to the point. I have a sand battle fan, a very nice one too. But, of course, Naruto said, you want something in exchange. What? Naturally, the demon said, I want a greater chakra allowance. Tripled. Naruto looked at the demon carefully. Tripling his allowance would give the demon access to a quarter of his chakra. Deal, the boy said. How do we get this fan of yours? We need to summon a gate to my storage area. It's a relatively simple jutsu, it just requires a lot of chakra. And there's one other problem. That being, I need to be the one to do the jutsu, Kyuubi said. Naruto looked at the demon suspiciously. Why? The jutsu cuts through space, and the user has to know the correct seals, the address, so to speak, of wherever they're going. I'm not giving you a free pass to raid my ancient collection of treasures whenever you want. If you want the fan, I do the jutsu. Just stick the sword in any vertical surface, walk through the gate, grab the fan, walk out. Fine, Naruto agreed, but if I get the slightest feeling of being tricked, Naruto let the threat hang in the air and let himself come back out to the real world, where Temari was looking at him oddly. I was talking with my sword, he has a way to get a fan for you, Naruto said as an explanation. He walked through the forest, looking for a suitable surface while Temari asked a question. So who is it in that sword, anyway? Some shinobi that was caught on the wrong of a sealing jutsu or something? Naruto shook his head, still looking for a vertical surface. Nah, greater demon, more specifically, the Nine-Tails demon fox. Temari had stopped moving about 3 seconds before. The Kyubi no Kitsune is in your sword. Naruto looked at her oddly. Yeah, it used to be in my stomach, but a forbidden jutsu used in the forging of my sword changed that. Why? Actually, Temari really couldn't think of a reason why. It just seemed like having a greater demon in your sword was something to make a big deal about. So let me get this straight, the demon fox has a fan I can use? Naruto shook his head. You can have it, I'm giving him more chakra in exchange. And where exactly is this fan? Temari asked skeptically. Naruto held out a hand to silence her as he found what he needed. A large rock had broken in half, leaving a flat surface. He slammed Kyrite into the rock and watched as it started to glow. Then the sword sank into the rock as a black doorway appeared. Temari's jaw hung slack as Naruto calmly walked in. He found himself in what appeared to be nothing more than a large room with white walls. It was filled with, well, everything. Stuff was everywhere, but Naruto figured a huge fan couldn't be hard to find, and he was proven right a short time later as he hauled it out from under a pile of scrolls and what looked like a gold statue of an unnamed shinobi. Temari continued to stand frozen as Naruto emerged from the door a few minutes later, carrying a large fan. He turned as the door closed behind him and Kyrite appeared to grow out of the blackness until the door was gone and the sword was exactly where Naruto had slammed it. He pulled his blade from the rock, replacing it on his back and handed the fan to Temari. It's amazing, he said, how useful a demon can be sometimes. Temari wasn't listening. She was in awe of what he had just handed to her. Temari had always used a basic battle fan, she had been using it for years, but had never been given a new one and had never complained. What she held now was a master's fan. The frame was dark metal, and the fan was a good foot longer than her old one. Nothing appeared much different on the outside, but Temari knew, when she opened it. With a subtle motion, the fan snapped open, and even Naruto took a momentary break from his babbling to admire it. The fan was painted to look like a sunset, and no inch of it was left uncolored. It was filled with reds and purples and pinks that made it look like the real thing. Temari hadn't known what the pattern painted on would be, but all master fans were painted to look like they lit the air itself on fire when swung. It was the most amazing thing she had ever seen. After his moment of admiration, Naruto went back to his ponderings about the many uses of having a demon. It was for that reason that, moments later, his brain shut down. His eyes told him Temari wasn't where she had been standing a moment ago. His ears only heard breathing. His nose smelled soap. His sense of taste wasn't receiving anything, but that was more than made up for by touch. Naruto wasn't someone experienced with full body contact, and never with a girl. But that was most definitely what was happening now. He unconsciously noted that in addition to all the previously mentioned things, he couldn't move. In other words, Temari was giving him a hug. Chapter 13, Dastardly Plotting. Temari sat in the forest with her new fan in her lap, laughing hysterically. Naruto looked over from where he was cooking supper and raised an eyebrow. What's so funny, exactly? The boy asked. Temari tried to control herself. In our village, giggle, there's always been the legend that wind masters could ignite the air. I always thought, snicker, that it was because their fans were painted to look like it. She started to laugh again and held up her fan for him to see. On the inside of the frame were carved words, starting with the kanji for Kaze Ninsho no Justu. The Burning Winds Technique. Temari looked at Naruto. There are only 3 fans like this in all of Hidden Sand, and they never make more. There are over 40 wind users who are Jounin level and only 3 of them know the jutsu I just read over. I've spent 9 years training with my battle fan, 300 swings a day, and learned a few low and mid-level skills. In the first week I spend with you, I find what's probably among the most powerful wind jutsus in existence. After saying it, Temari wasn't sure what she thought of this new revelation. Naruto, however, just shrugged. So? My strength has at least doubled in the couple months it's been since I left Konoha. It's to be expected of missing means. Seeing Temari's curiosity, he elaborated. The idea of a hidden village is that it teaches a certain set of skills, which it keeps secret. For example, Mist jutsus aren't taught in Hidden Leaf and fire jutsus are rarely taught in Hidden Mist. This means that people are very limited in what they learn. Nookanins, on the other hand, have no such restrictions. He continued on, checking the food as he did so. The sword I use is a mist sword. No one in Leaf uses such weapons, but I do because it suits me. I know that you love your fan, but I can and intend to teach you every jutsu I know. It's a sharing of resources, and it's what makes missing means so strong. Temari nodded, though the idea of learning foreign jutsus sounded odd to her. It made a lot of sense. Seeing the food was cooked, Naruto took it off the fire and sat down next to Temari's fan. His own words had given him an idea. How long, he asked, will it take you to learn that fire jutsu written on your fan? Temari thought for a moment, assuming we spend most of each day traveling, about a week to be good enough to use it, but completely mastering a jutsu like this takes years. Naruto started digging through scroll pouches on his vest. He finally found what he was looking for and passed it to her. It was the scroll of basic stealth jutsus from Hidden Mist the old barber had given him. I want you, he said, to learn the first jutsu in that scroll, Mizu Gyushiku no Jutsu, water condensation technique. It's a basic jutsu used to help people learn Kirigakure no Jutsu. It supersaturates the air around you with water, like on a very humid day. And why? Temari asked, am I doing this? Naruto started to eat and spoke between bites. I have an idea, but I won't say anything else until I see this burning winds technique of yours. More importantly, if we move at a steady pace, I expect the next hunter squad to catch up to us in just under 2 weeks. I want to be ready for them when they appear. Naruto took a bite of rice and chewed for a minute. They won't make the same mistakes as last time, they'll be far better prepared, and there'll probably be more of them. All this means that not only will I need your help this time, we need to plan in advance. Temari set down her fan and grabbed some food for herself, and the two spent the evening talking. By the time Temari slid her fan into her sleeping bag and crawled in next to it, her mind was a whirlwind of activity. She had just decided to help ambush a group of Leaf Nin, allies of her country. Her status as a Nuke Nin would be unquestionable after this. Somehow, that thought didn't bother her nearly so much as it should have. As the Leaf army set up camp for the night, Tsunade sent a messenger to Irika. She had finally arranged for the transfer of everyone he needed. She had temporarily transferred 7 shinobi to the Hunter Nin and their first group briefing was to start in 10 minutes. When said time arrived, Irika strode into a tent of mostly confused-looking faces. Irika quickly took control. Everyone, shut up. He called, silencing the group. As some of you know, he continued, you are here because you have been temporarily put under my command for a very important mission. That is to find and incapacitate Uzumaki Naruto by any means necessary. Irika saw a couple people gasp slightly and went on, I want each of you to tell me, now, why you've been selected for this team. You need to understand that before anything else, go from right to left. The person on Irika's far right stood. I am here, Marino Ibiki said, because I am the best personality analyzer in Konoha. My purpose is to study the target's movements and figure out what he'll do next. Irika had done some digging and discovered that Ibiki had played a similar role in the hunt for Uchiha Itachi. Ibiki sat and the second person stood. I am here, said Hyuga Niji, to act as a scout for the squad. Irika was pleased with that answer. He had been afraid the Hyuga might start into a speech about destiny. The third member stood, as troublesome as it is, I am here to strategize, and because I'm the only one to see Naruto's powers of manifestation. Shikamaru added a grumble for added effect. Number 4 stood, I guess I'm here because I'm somewhat experienced with the habits of S-class criminals. Enko smirked as she finished. The fifth member just looked lost, so Irika stepped in. Tenten is here, he said, because she has by far the most experience with weapons, and as of now, we know nothing about the sword Naruto carries or how to counter it. The sixth member stood and casually put his book away. I guess I'm here because Naruto was on my team, so I know him pretty well, and of course, because I'm a jounin. All the Genin and Chunin glared. Kakashi just smiled under his mask. The seventh member stood looking only slightly nervous. Tsunade-sama has sent me to act as the squad's medic and her representative. Shizun quickly sat back down. Irika surveyed his team. He hadn't asked for Shizun, but knew she would be a good addition. First thing, Irika looked pointedly at Kakashi. I don't care what your rank is, you're under my command until the Hokage says otherwise. He got a round of nods. Good, now on to the briefing. Irika had decided to start off with a demonstration, so he took the photos of Gaara and Sasuke the Hokage had transferred to clear plastic and overlapped them. "We are looking," he said as he held the overlaid pictures up to the light, "for someone of almost exactly this hair color." Ibiki nodded slowly, but the rest had wide eyes. Irika set the pictures down and turned to his team. Right now, Naruto is changing, and so he looks to what he admires to see how he should change. It's a period all missing nin go through, redefining their identity, but it doesn't last forever. If we are ever going to catch him, we need to do it now, while he is relatively predictable. Irika started to pace as he talked, but there are complications, not the least of which is Temari of the Sand. Initially, she was his prisoner, but we have a report stating she killed one of the hunter nin last sent after them, so we have no idea what to expect from her. As time passed, Irika called various team members up to explain certain things. Ibiki gave a speech on the possibility that Naruto was using the accumulation of fear stimulus, which most of the team members had never heard of before. Tenten was asked to talk about the various methods Naruto could be using to control his swords, and Enko talked about making sure they didn't allow themselves to go easy on him because he had once been their friend. She calmly explained that they would have enough problems beating him going all out, never mind if one of them got cold feet. At the end of 4 long hours, Irika let them go off to bed, as they were leaving for Konoha early the next morning. Most left feeling they had accomplished a great deal, but they all knew they were short on information. All they could do now was speculate based on the words of a single hunter nin. Once the tent was cleared, Irika sat alone and rubbed his head. He couldn't believe he was doing this, but also knew it needed to be done. This was the best shot they would ever have. They knew approximately where the boy was, and what he was doing. More importantly, they had an idea of who he was. A year from now, Naruto could be a completely different person. Irika knew he was the only one who could do this. Not even Kakashi understood Uzumaki Naruto the way he did. He couldn't allow himself to fail. Gaara, Kankuro, and Baki sat in their tent, facing each other somberly. Kankuro smirked at his jounin teacher, "Go fish." Baki cursed silently. He had been sure Kankuro had it too. He drew the 4 of clubs and re-examined his hand. It wasn't looking good. Baki decided to gamble. "Gaara, do you have any 4s? The red-haired boy glared as he handed his 4 of diamonds over. The 3 were now relaxing with a game of Go Fish after hours of dastardly plotting. They knew the worst they could do was slow the hunt, but they intended to do that as much as possible. The first act had already been done, as Gaara had used his sand to steal all the hunter nin masks in camp and had hidden them in a bag. He then found a hornet's nest in a tree in the forest and used the bag to block it. Whoever removed the bag would get a rather unwelcome surprise. Naruto woke up the next morning with a sense of purpose. They were only 3 hours from a small city, and he decided they would spend the day there. He figured that the 2 of them needed some time to enjoy themselves. They had made excellent time over the last couple days and were ahead of schedule, and Naruto also didn't want to get too far ahead of the hunters. That may have sounded odd, but his plan required that he know when the hunter nins were coming, and if they initially escaped and the hunters couldn't find them, who knew when the masked shinobi would find them again. Naruto started to pack up camp just as Temari was waking up. As had become their custom, Naruto turned his back as she got out of her sleeping bag, and after 15 seconds or so, went back to whatever he had been doing. The 2 were soon running and arrived at the edge of the city at around 11 o'clock. The first order of business was, as always, to find a place to stay. Temari suggested a tall hotel so they could practice on the roof without being seen from the ground. Naruto agreed and soon they had a room. They both quickly retreated to the roof where Temari was practicing Mizugyushiku no Jutsu while Naruto counted their money. They were still well off, but the money would run out just before or as they arrived at Hidden Cloud, so they would have to find work quickly. Meanwhile, Temari was having some problems with her practicing. She managed to gather water into the air around her, but it took a long time. She clocked herself at about 30 seconds to complete the jutsu. The other problem was that her cloths were soaked through, and she would swear Sirai Kurite was leering at her. She would be just starting the jutsu, and she would have this incredibly creepy feeling run down her spine, but when she turned, the sword was just sitting there on the roof next to Naruto, same as always. Inside the sword, Kyubi was grinning to himself. He had noticed that he had become more easily amused after 14 years of imprisonment, but didn't really mind. Every time Temari turned her back, the demon would manifest just a little bit of his head, enough to stare at her until she started to turn and the demon dropped the manifestation. This went on for 20 minutes or so until Naruto noticed, immediately telling the fox to give it a rest, as Temari was starting to look mentally unstable. Finished with his monetary evaluation, Naruto stood and stretched. "You up for a taijutsu spar?" the boy asked the still irate San Nin. Temari nodded abruptly and brought her fan into the ready position. Naruto looked at it nervously. You do realize, he said, that taijutsu means no wind blasts. I seriously doubt the hotel would appreciate a hole in its roof. Temari didn't even bother to respond, she just ran, swinging low, trying to take Naruto's legs out from under him. Naruto decided to experiment. He blocked the fan with his sword and sent an image to Kyubi. Temari expected her attack to be blocked, but didn't expect the counterattack to come if the form of a manifested glowing claw. She flung herself backwards, just dogging the demon's swipe. The spar continued mostly like that. The sand girl found herself often able to block Siriai Kirite if she saw it coming, but the demon and Naruto were working together in synchronization. Kyubi could manifest from anywhere on the sword at any time, making him completely unpredictable. The final experiment came when Naruto threw his blade, which Temari just managed to dodge, only to find herself flying through the air. Kyubi had manifested from the flying blade and grabbed her ankle. Since letting go meant dropping her, Kyubi just flew around in a full circle, releasing Temari so she fell into Naruto, causing both Nins to go sprawling. They tried to untangle themselves while Siriai Kirite embedded itself in the roof, oozing self-satisfaction. Both deciding that was enough sparring for the day, and as it was around noon, the two went back to their room and started to think about lunch. To Temari's mild shock, Naruto changed into one of his t-shirts, and even more odd was that he left his sword in the room and told her to do the same with her fan. I really don't like the idea of walking around unarmed. I just got the fan a couple days ago and am still getting used to it. Naruto waved off her concerns. Siriai Kirite will watch the room and make sure nothing happens to your fan. We, he said with a grin, are going out. At this point, Temari demonstrated the art of appearing embarrassed and angry at the same time. It's a subtle combination of a light blush and narrowed eyes. Naruto figured she was about to ask why, so he just grabbed her hand and walked out of the room. 3 minutes later, the two were walking down the street, Temari's complaints and questions forgotten. So, where are we going, exactly? She asked curiously. It's a surprise. I don't like surprises, tell me. Naruto stopped walking and turned to examine her for a moment. Without warning, he closed the distance between them, wrapping his arms around her neck. A moment of fiddling later, he pulled off her forehead protector and slid it into his pocket with a grin. Temari remained frozen for a few seconds longer, then glared, but noticed he wasn't wearing his own either. Naruto shrugged. We won't need to be shinobi today, so there's no need to advertise that we are shinobi. Temari continued to glare. Next time, tell me. I'll do it. Naruto shrugged again. Okay, but he was still grinning. Temari didn't realize she had forgotten to ask where they were going until they arrived. Back in their hotel room, the maid was vacuuming the floor when she suddenly jumped and screamed. There was no one in the room, but she would swear someone had just pinched her. Elsewhere, the Konoha camp was chaos. No less than 7 incidents had occurred since this morning, and Tsunade was starting to get significantly annoyed. It had all started when 2 hunter Nin had come to her reporting that their masks were missing. It was soon noticed that all the masks were missing. An hour of searching later, a squad covered in wasp stings fell at her feet, holding the bag of masks. Since then, a group of people had gotten sick from food poisoning, a group of genin had gotten lost in the forest, numerous shinobi had found small stinging animals in their shoes, and Ino had somehow escaped her guard and had traumatized 3 patients in the hospital with her incessant whining. The Hokage was sure all these events had something to do with the 3 all-too-innocent-looking sand shinobi in front of her, but had no proof. Gaara, Kankuro and Baki stood there smiling warmly, showing no trace of malice. Tsunade had called the 3 here to discuss Baki's request for the squad to remain in Konoha to monitor events concerning Temari. She knew the 3 were just going to disrupt the hunt, but couldn't say that for political reasons. She was about to make up a reason to deny Baki's request when she noticed water on the ground and a chunin burst into the room. Hokage-sama! You won't believe this. Come look outside. Sensing the urgency, Tsunade rushed out of the tent and gasped. The whole camp was covered in 8 inches of water, which was very quickly turning the field into a swamp. The 3 sand nins were no less surprised than the Hokage at his sight before them. This hadn't been one of their many plots, none of them had the power to do this. Anbu suddenly dropped around them. The leader quickly kneeled in the mud and gave his report. It's some type of unknown water jutsu that brings water from underground rivers and springs to the surface. We sensed a large chakra signature, but when we arrived at its location the jutsu was done and there was no trace of the user. We did however, find this. The Anbu commander handed Tsunade a sealed note, which she opened. Dear Hokage. Just a note to inform you that your security is a little lax. I've been here for 5 hours and no one's noticed me. I was hoping for a decent fight, but in lieu of that, I've left you a present to remind you to be more observant. I hope your robes and scrolls kept are in a water-resistant bag. Itachi. In the margin was a drawing of a cloaked figure giving peace sign. Tsunade swore and crumpled the note in her hand. She looked out at the mess that had been an organized military camp only hours earlier. It might be 1 or 2 days before the main force could move out again. They'd have to find the nearest river and camp there, as almost everything would need to be washed. One man had just set an army back 2 to 3 days. Tsunade sighed, I know it's hopeless, but search the area just in case Itachi decided to hang around. Other than that, everyone salvage what they can from the mud. Deciding that her declaration applied to them too, the 3 sand snuck out the other way. Gaara made a note to find and learn that water jutsu. Temari walked excitedly through the street fair, looking at everything. Open shops and stands really didn't work in hidden sand, as windstorms were too violent. Naruto just followed her slowly, as she rushed from one stall to the next, oblivious to the afternoon's heat. Naruto had always enjoyed places like this, but had only ever worked up the nerve to go to a festival in Konoha once. It had been the best night of his life until someone had recognized him and a small riot started. Thankfully, there was no riot this time, just an overenthusiastic girl. Temari stopped for a moment to stare covetously at the merchandise of an old lady selling intricate fans. They were of normal size, but beautiful all the same. Her attention was soon diverted, however, when she saw a stand selling mini donuts. Realizing she had no money, she looked for Naruto. Said boy was walking down the center of the walkway when Temari rushed up to him. I need money for mini donuts. Why? Because I've never had mini donuts before. Temari said, as if it were obvious. Naruto sighed and handed over his wallet. You can spend 3,000 yen, no more. Temari dashed off to buy snacks while Naruto fingered the money in his pocket. The old lady's fans sold for 4,000 yen. He had 4,300 yen. It was a lot of money. He remembered the way her face had lit up when he had given her the master-level battle fan in the forest. Money wasn't that important after all. Chapter 14, Never Forgive, Never Forget. Temari was practically bouncing as the two left the street fair. It was very unlike her to be this hyper, but she was slightly tipsy and on a sugar high, induced by 4 bags of mini donuts and too many free samples of sake. Naruto was following her at a distance looking slightly exasperated. About the only thing he had done in the last 2 hours was give Temari the fan he had bought her. She loved it, and that alone made it worth the money, but Naruto was wishing he'd given it to her later. See, Temari had quickly discerned that there was no reason she couldn't use wine jutsus with a smaller fan. Combine that with her temper, her being only slightly drunk, and a sugar high, and what you got was a rather dangerous girl. She had already threatened a stall keeper who she claimed had cheated her, when in fact she had missed the target she had been aiming at. The man hadn't known why the strange young woman was waving her fan at him, and Naruto intervened before a small windstorm disrupted the fair. It was then decided that it was time to go back. So now, the two were walking back to their hotel, except that random things in the vicinity regularly distracted Temari. It wasn't that she wasn't moving, she was just moving very slowly. Finally, Naruto settled for the same method he had used to get her to leave the room in the first place. He just took hold of her hand and started off at a high pace. Eventually, Temari started to calm down, and a few blocks from the hotel she pulled her hand from Naruto's. When they arrived, Naruto said he wanted to go for a run, so Temari went back to the room alone and flopped down onto her bed, covering her head with her hands. She was confused. Her entire life had really been a very simple process. She had gone to the academy, become a shinobi, and the theoretical continuation of her life should have included a perfect mission record until she was a jounin and a lifetime of service to her village. In her entire life, she had really only ever had to deal with 4 males on a regular basis. Her father, who was an ass, who Temari ignored, Baki, whose 2 passions in life were being melodramatic and playing Go Fish, who Temari was indifferent to, Gaara, who had been insane most of her life, and who she had been mostly afraid of, and Kankuro, whose main hobby was pissing her off, who she beat on. She now found herself in a situation where she had a new person to deal with and a new life to plan for. For all her efforts, Naruto was an enigma to her. He wasn't anything like anyone she had ever met before. At first, she had been afraid of him, but that fear was vanishing faster every day. The more she thought about it, the more human he became. Naruto had never hurt her in any way, quite the contrary in fact. He had been nothing but kind and generous. It was, she justified, his fault she was in this position in the first place, but she doubted most kidnappers were as nice as he was. But for all that, she had never yet managed to shake the memory of how she had first seen him on the field of battle, his eyes burning with a dark inner fire as she found herself frozen in terror. But equally impossible was it to forget how just this afternoon he had been so sweet. Never once complaining, always complimenting her when she won a game, and picking out that fan for her. Temari rubbed her temples. All this thinking was giving her a headache. Baki sat with his face firm, his eyes unwavering as he stared across the table at his opponent. Gaara stared back, undaunted, his whole body perfectly still. Kankuro, the moderator, sat between them, a deck of cards sitting unopened in his hand. Championship matches were always held with a fresh deck. It was also tradition that each player had to bet something of personal value. Baki took out a katana passed down in his family for 3 generations and set it down. Not willing to be outdone, Gaara set his special edition of Ika Ika Paradise, the motion picture, down on the table. Baki's eyes widened. The stakes were high indeed. Kankuro carefully unwrapped the cards, shuffled them, and slowly started to deal. The tension built until both players had their hands ready and Kankuro placed the deck in the middle of the table. The puppet master raised his hand and brought it down dramatically. Go, fish. Naruto ran. He found himself reminiscing, as his afternoon with Temari had reminded him of times long past. Of another afternoon he had spent with another person who could smile so brightly, despite the hardship they were dealing with. He wondered idly what it was that gave Haku and Temari the ability to do that. As always, he was soon lost deep in the depths of his mind. As Zabuza stood immobile, Kakashi had started to lecture about how Zabuza's ambitions were too dangerous and how no shinobi should act that way. Zabuza laughed, "I don't give a damn, I fight for my ideals, and that shall continue." It was a statement made by someone who in his heart knew he had lost, but the demon of the mist had never given up. For the first time in months, tears started to run down Naruto's face as he ran through the city. He could remember it as if he were still there, Zabuza already half dead, taking on a horde with nothing but a kunai in his mouth, fighting with all his soul to protect the memory of his precious person. The boy continued to let these dark memories roll over him, when he suddenly stopped. Naruto had been running for many minutes and was atop a bridge, looking down at a flowing river. He suddenly pulled out his forehead protector, examining it. Everything about it was the same as when he had modified it months before, the kanji for demonic mirage staring back at him. It was then that he realized he'd made an error in judgment. He had been worrying ever since he left Konoha about whether he would be able to live up to Zabuza's legacy, whether he was worthy of holding the demon's sword. He realized as he stood atop that bridge that he had been foolish in thinking either of those things were what had made Zabuza great. It didn't matter how strong he was, as long as he was strong enough to protect his ideals and what was precious to him. Both Zabuza and Haku had tried to live like that, and had both died without regret in trying. Naruto released his forehead protector and watched as it fell and landed with a tiny splash in the water. Kakashi had said that fighting only for your ideals and those precious to you was no way to be a ninja. If that were true, Naruto didn't want to be one. He slowly turned and walked back towards the hotel, feeling refreshed. He had Kirite and Temari's smile. He had strength, and a precious person to protect. Baki fought to maintain his composure as he felt hundreds of eyes on him. Shortly after the start of their game, the Hokage had interrupted, and as any form of gambling immediately entranced Tsunade, everyone who was looking for the Hokage had come to their tent. Soon, the tent had been disassembled around their ears as more people wanted to watch, but the game had never paused. Both players were cautious. The game was more than half over, with Gaara showing a 1-pair lead. More people gathered, and some were standing on chairs to see over the throng. Somewhere in the crowd, a chunin had set up some huge speakers and was playing Eye of the Tiger. Baki made a daring move. "Gaara, do you have any fives?" The crowd collectively held their breath, until Gaara slowly pulled a card from his hand and passed it over. Everyone burst into cheers and claps, waiting anxiously for Gaara to make his move. Elsewhere in camp, Iruka was fretting. There were too many delays. His squad would have to start the hunt now, without returning to Konoha first. This was very unusual, but time was of the essence. Iruka had taken the initiative and ordered a group meeting without consulting Tsunade. He had ordered his team to get ready to leave in 4 hours. Now came the problem. Iruka would have to explain to the Hokage exactly why it was he was breaking regulation and going behind her back. But he would make her understand. He had to. This was their only chance. As Iruka planned his departure, Naruto was just arriving back to the hotel. The first thing Temari noticed from her prone position was that he seemed more invigorated than he had when he'd left. His eyes had just a bit more fire behind them. He grinned, "I hope you're enjoying your break. Tomorrow, we leave the city and train." Temari looked skeptical. "Train? Shouldn't we be putting more distance between our pursuers and us?" Naruto shook his head. "Running is mostly pointless, they will find us eventually, and so we'll travel only a few hours a day and devote ourselves to training." With that, Naruto walked over to his bed and flopped on it. The two lay there, unmoving, basking in the fact that, at least for now, they could relax. Far away, Baki stood among a cheering crowd, holding Gaara's special edition tape above him proudly. -8 days later. Hyuga Niji ran through the forest. They had been traveling constantly since the departure from the Konoha camp, and it was suspected that they would soon find their prey. He knew the others were somewhere nearby, but it was his job to initiate contact. After that, he was just supposed to fight as hard and as long as possible. He only accepted his task because he trusted in his team to uphold their part in the plan. Niji understood the role he was to play, but that didn't mean he liked it. Temari stood behind Naruto in the forest, her hands guiding his through unfamiliar motions. She was finding it interesting how something that felt so natural to her could be so alien to someone else. She was also finding it mildly awing how fast Naruto was able to learn jutsus. He was slightly clumsy, but held the huge fan confidently. It had taken her 3 months to learn the basic kamaitachi, it took him only 7 days. Temari was feeling weak. On the other hand, she was infinitely stronger than when she had been kidnapped. Her progress with Kaze Ninsho no Justa had been swift, and she was now able to make the slicing winds hot, if not scorching. She had also, at Naruto's request, continued to practice Mizu Gyushiku no Jutsu, and had become adept at that as well. Naruto hesitated in his motion and Temari snapped back to reality. His hands had slipped, so she replaced his hands in the correct places and took a step back. "Try it again." He nodded and again started the motions. Temari had explained that it simply wasn't possible to try to use a fan in combat without knowing at least a little of the taijutsu that went along with the huge weapons. The Sannin looked over at Kyuubi's practice, and was, as always, impressed. Siriai Kurite was stuck in the ground, surrounded by trees. The demon was trying to manifest and destroy the trees farther and farther away, using the least amount of chakra possible. Kyuubi had been practicing with Naruto or by himself almost constantly, because if there was one thing the demon hated, it was weakness. As amazing as it was watching huge glowing red appendages tear apart a forest, the boy and demon together were even more astounding. The two had been practicing synchronizing their thoughts and perceptions, and now both could see into a bit of each other's minds. All these thoughts passed through Temari's mind as she came to her arch-nemesis, the water balloon. This had been her assigned practice for the afternoon. She had been nervous when Naruto had grinned so much while explaining what she would be trying to do, and now she understood why. The thing just wouldn't break. She could spin the water with her chakra, but never managed to get anything close to the pulsating and exploding that Naruto had achieved with so little apparent effort. It was pissing her off, to say the least. Naruto let out a yell as he finally got the motions right, not slipping or hesitating once. He looked at Temari to find her glaring heatedly at the small water-filled object in her hand. He knew she didn't have the chakra capacity yet for a full-fledged Rasengan, but intended for her to at least start practicing. He had been serious when he had said he was going to teach her everything he knew. Naruto glanced at the sky. Temari, supper sounds good right now, you done practicing?" Temari threw the balloon violently against a tree as Naruto retrieved his sword. He took that as a yes. He passed her fan back to her and they walked the short distance back to camp. "So what is it today?" the boy asked. "Dehydrated rice or dehydrated rice?" "Hard choice," Temari muttered. Naruto just grabbed a pot and started the 5-minute walk to the river, humming to himself. When he arrived, his hand flew immediately to the blade on his back. Someone was watching him. Naruto turned to the left, and found a pair of white eyes looking upon him with hatred. He slowly removed his hand from Siriai Kurite's handle. "Yo, Niji. I was wondering when someone would show up." The Hyuga's glare became even darker. "I was told not to confront you if we met, but I don't need a team to beat scum like you, Byakugan." The veins burst out around Niji's eyes as Naruto responded with a smile. "That's a little arrogant, isn't it? But I'll tell you what, since you're going to be so brave, I won't even remove the sword from my back. That should make it at least amusing." Niji practically boiled with rage as he charged. Naruto noticed that Niji had become much faster, and it took some effort for Naruto to dodge the Hyuga's first few punches. Soon, the two were exchanging blows at a steady pace. Naruto was starting to get mildly concerned, as Neji wasn't using his gentle fist, just ordinary punches. Leaping back, Naruto opted for his usual, and created a small army of shadow clones and ordered them to attack. The fight that followed really wasn't anything new. Neji fought methodically, slowly reducing the number of clones until Akaten removed the last 5. He had to admit, Neji had gotten much better, but Naruto really didn't have time to play with the Hyuga. The two closed again and now Naruto could feel the telltale chakra surrounding Neji's hands. They were playing for keeps this time. Neji glared yet again, only slightly out of breath, and fell into a stance Naruto remembered all too well. Do you have any last words? Knowing Neji had the honor to wait while he decided what to say, Naruto had an idea, sent an image to the fox. Can we pull this off? Naruto mentally asked. Yep, the fox replied, and Naruto could feel the demon's grin. Without killing Neji, I suppose. The fox's grin grew wider. Back in the real world, Naruto felt his perception extend as he and Kyuubi synced their thoughts. He looked up at Neji. I have words to say, and I want you to never forget them. The Hyuga nodded slightly, but his eyes widened as Naruto fell into a stance that mirrored his own. The fox boy smirked. It's over, you are within the field of my hack. Neji's only response was to attack, gentle fist style, hands of hack. 2 hands. Neji called. 4 hands. Naruto called simultaneously. If Neji was shocked when Naruto called out at the same time he did, he was even more shocked when Naruto successfully blocked 2 strikes and landed 2 of his own. Neji knew it was impossible for any non-Hyuga to use the hands of hack, and yet Naruto was doing it and starting with 4. Despite all this, Neji refused to be intimidated. Naruto wouldn't be able to keep up with his speed forever. 4, 8. Neji growled as his 4 strikes were blocked, and he felt 4 strikes land on his body. 8, 16. Again, Neji was thwarted. 16, 32. Neji was slightly worried, this shouldn't be possible. 32, 64. His body was in agony as Naruto blocked all 32 of his strikes and landed 32 of his own. 64, 128. He had won. Naruto's strikes had always missed slightly. Neji had some burned tenketsu, but none were completely closed. Naruto was doing the impossible, imitating a Hyuga skill of the highest level, but there was no way to block his next attack. 128 was as many strikes as the greatest of Hyuga could manage. 120. Neji stopped. Halfway through his final strike, 2 wickedly clawed red arms manifested from the sword on Naruto's back. Hack, Demon Claw. 256 hands. Neji tried to block, but it was impossible. All 4 arms were striking with godlike speed, and where Naruto missed the tenketsu, the demonic arms had perfect aim. The final blow was landed on Neji's chest, sending him flying back. He smashed into a tree and fell to the ground, unmoving. Naruto snorted as the Kyuubi dissipated his arms. The Hyuga really were stupid. The greatest attack they had required that their enemies be slower than them, in one place, and limited to 2 arms. Beyond that, when all was said and done, the hands of hack were rarely lethal. Then again, he thought, on the positive side, he had gotten his first field test of his and Kyuubi's mind sync. He had been impressed when, in practice sessions, Kyuubi's perception had shown the ability to give a blurry image of the chakra systems of nearby people. Naruto sighed, picked up his pot, and headed back to camp. Unfortunately, they didn't have time for supper anymore. As soon as he set foot in camp, he had an idea of what had happened. Temari was nowhere to be seen. Her fan was lying near the fire. She would never have left without it. Sitting on the ground was his magnetic chess set, only 3 pieces on the board. A black king and black queen were being pincered by a white knight. It was a position where the knight could take either the king or queen on his next turn. The only way for the black king to survive is to sacrifice the black queen to his opponent. The whole thing with Neji had been a setup. The bastards had taken Temari. Naruto growled and gripped Shirai Kirite's handle. They had gone too far this time. He was done with holding back. Chapter 15, Theirs is but to do and die. Naruto paced restlessly around camp, cursing his own stupidity. It seemed so obvious in retrospect, the leaf didn't dare attack him head-on. Naruto was now sure that the hunters didn't know what his relationship with Temari was, and so they couldn't risk that she was still just his prisoner. So the only thing they could do was take her and interrogate her. Naruto resisted the powerful urge to destroy something. He needed to be calm, his opponents were smart, and so he had to be too. Taking a deep breath, Naruto analyzed the situation. From his enemy's perspective, taking Temari served many purposes. Finding out whether she was a voluntary nuke nin, or whether Naruto had forced her. Finding out about Naruto's tactics and skills, picking apart what she knew about his mind. The problem was, Naruto didn't know how Temari would answer. Would she betray him to the leaf? Would she resist and risk her life? Would she just sit silently and not respond? He cursed and punched a tree. Worst of all was that he knew the final and most obvious reason for kidnapping Temari was that it would drive Naruto crazy wondering whether the girl was dead, and unfortunately, it was working. He forced himself to be calm. Temari could take care of herself, and fighting while mad was the worst thing a person could do. Now focused, he started examining the campsite more closely. He could determine many things about the hunter squad just from looking at their work. There was no sign of a struggle, so Temari had been surprised. Naruto could personally attest to the fact that this was no small feat, so there was at least one jounin on the team. The positioning of the chess pieces was a brilliant psychological taunt, so he was facing someone who either was very smart or knowledgeable about the workings of the human mind. Considering Niji's presence, Naruto was betting that the chess was the work of Shikamaru. They were hoping to weaken his resolve by forcing him to fight his ex-friends. 2 hours ago, it might have worked. Niji was badly wounded, and assuming Temari was just unconscious, he refused to think otherwise. They wouldn't be able to transport her very far. They knew that they were giving Naruto a major chance to escape either way, and wouldn't let themselves be more than an hour from his position. If he moved fast, he should be able to find them within 5 hours using a crisscross pattern. Wasting no more time, he dashed off into the forest, heading back to where he had last seen Niji. If he centered his search there, he might get lucky and find the hunters within the hour. Irika and Shizen ran through the forest, Shizen carrying Niji in her arms. She had been horrified after only a brief examination and immediately declared that he needed to get to a real hospital, as she didn't have the resources to treat him in the forest. Since Irika was the only one who wasn't needed immediately as part of the plan, he was her escort and guard. Shizen would run with Niji if Naruto found them, leaving Irika to cover their escape. Irika understood better than anyone that his team was the best for the job, but he still worried as he pushed himself, trying to move as fast as humanly possible. He had left Ibiki in charge, but still wished he could be there himself. He was broken out of his thoughts as Niji moaned, and he turned to see the Hyuga starting to shift in Shizen's arms. Irika cursed and started to run faster. He wasn't going to let anyone die. Temari slowly awoke, but trying to think was like swimming through mud. She tried to move, and upon finding she couldn't, sighed silently. She was really getting tired of waking up groggy and immobile. She kept her eyes closed and stayed perfectly still, not wanting to alert anyone as to her wakefulness. She could feel all her body parts, and that was a good sign, but missing was the comforting weight of her shuriken holsters and battle fan. Without much hope, she shifted her weight slightly and was surprised when she felt all her hidden kunai exactly where they were supposed to be. Whoever had taken all her obvious weaponry hadn't bothered to search her. As an experiment, she shifted again and felt a lump. Temari had tucked the small fan Naruto had given at the fair into her sash for safekeeping. It was still there. Not wasting time searching her for concealed weapons was understandable if there were time constraints, but the small wood fan in her sash was obvious, and anyone who didn't bother to take a fan from a wind user, even a tied-up wind user, would have to be either the most powerful or laziest shinobi in existence. A short distance away, an oblivious Shikamaru sat staring at clouds. He had taken the least troublesome job, as everyone else was out patrolling the forest. His mind, happily distracted by floating white puffs, paid very little attention to his, supposedly, unconscious prisoner. Behind him, Temari carefully opened her eyes. She immediately recognized Shikamaru, which answered the question of who had tied her up and failed to search her, but didn't tell her what to do next. The shadow user was leaning up against a tree, facing away from her and staring at the sky. Temari could feel her hidden kunai in her right sleeve. If she could reach it, cutting herself would be simple. The only obstacle was Shikamaru. Temari knew she would have to be very careful and quiet, because if the pineapple-haired boy noticed she was awake and caught wind of her plan, she would be sunk. She started to move, agonizingly slowly, shifting her body so the hidden kunai would slide out of its hiding place. She knew it might take a while at this speed, but impatience could ruin her only chance of escape. Ibiki and Enko stood uneasily in the forest. Both knew that everything was going according to plan, but neither could shake the nervousness that came with waiting. Provoking an enraged demon boy to attack you seemed like a much better idea around a planning table surrounded by your teammates. Irika had said flatly that despite how much the boy may have changed, there was no way Naruto would abandon someone he had decided was his responsibility. The plan had developed logically from there: kidnap Temari when the two Nukanins were apart, then allow Naruto to come to them. Kakashi had been the one to capture Temari, and everything had seemed perfect until Shizun had arrived at the rendezvous point with Niji's broken body. They had all assumed Niji would at least be able to hold his own against Naruto for a few minutes. They had been wrong. Now they were short 3 members, leaving only one to guard Temari, and 4 people split into 2-man teams on the lookout for the fox boy. Niji had been Chunin level, and he had been completely and utterly crushed. That left even the Jounin slightly disturbed. It was for this reason that as they watched the silent forest, Ibiki had lost his usual aura of casualness and Enko was completely serious. Tension was thick in the air as they stood back to back in the forest. Neither could put a finger on exactly what it was that was bothering them, but the disturbance was there nonetheless. It was then that the mist started to form. The Leaf Nin resisted the immediate urge to set off their signal flares. They didn't want to call Kakashi and Tenten to back them up unless they were sure the mist wasn't a diversion. Within the fog, Naruto stood calmly holding Siri Kirite. Ibiki and Enko couldn't see him, but he could see them. He was one with his sword and one with his surroundings. It wasn't a feeling that could be described to someone who hadn't felt it, as he couldn't see things around him, but he knew they were there all the same. He knew the position of every tree, rock and plant for 20 feet in every direction. He felt rather than saw the agitated movements of the 2 Jounin in front of him, but it really didn't matter. He knew where they were, and they had no idea where he was. His eyes narrowed and shone with a dark inner light. Both Jounin easily dogged Naruto's initial strike, as their instincts had been honed from 100 battles, but the boy went straight into high gear. He knew that both Leaf Nins had much larger ninjutsu collections than his own, and so he would have to pressure them so much they had no time for jutsus. Kyuubi's 8 Siri Kirite clones were already in the air, and Naruto had directed the demon to focus on Ibiki, leaving Naruto himself to deal with Enko. Said female Leaf Nin was currently pulling off her best acrobatics in an effort to dodge Siri Kirite and the dark boy who wielded it like it weighed no more than a kunai. Enko had known the boy would be strong, but her current situation was ridiculous. She suddenly saw an opening in Naruto's defense and went for it. Seeing the kunai aimed at his heart, Naruto jumped, taking his sword into an upward slash. Knowing it was too late to reverse her momentum, Enko brought her 2 kunai down to block, and they held for a second, but were no match for the demonic blade. Both kunai were cut cleanly in half and Siri Kirite continued upwards, almost severing his left leg and leaving a deep gash in her side. Naruto would have reversed the blade and come down on her for the killing blow but felt an explosion behind him. He spun in the air, kicking Enko out of the way as he did so. Ibiki just stood there, grinning at him. The interrogator's right side had been completely mangled by Kyuubi's spinning sword clones, his right arm and leg in shreds, but in his left hand he held a flare gun. Naruto's eyes widened as Ibiki continued to grin as he collapsed. The fox boy growled, baring his fangs as he ran to pick up his bag and Temari's battle fan before continuing towards where he figured the Leaf camp would be. Unfortunately, the explosion had completely awoken Shikamaru from his oblivion, and he was now standing alertly above as Temari faked sleep. She had the kunai in her hand, but hadn't cut her bonds yet, and if she moved it would be a battle of speed between her and the shadow user to see who would strike first. Deciding she had to risk it, Temari cut the ropes on her hands and brought the kunai down to cut her leg bonds while her other hand grabbed the fan out of her sash. Shikamaru immediately noticed her movement out of the corner of his eye and was starting the seals for the shadow bind when a Chibi Itachi slammed into the side of his head. Shikamaru crumpled to the ground and Temari jumped to her feet, trying to get the blood flowing in her limbs again. Oddly enough, in all her plans to escape it had never occurred to her that she was now willingly acting like a missing Nin. Not willing to waste time contemplating this fact, as the flare probably meant trouble for Naruto, Temari started to run in the direction of where the flare had gone off. The ex-San Nin hadn't gotten very far when she felt 2 presences right behind her. Just as she was pondering how to get away, a form sped in front of her and cut her off. Temari found herself facing one normal eye and one Sharingan, and knew she was in rather deep trouble. Kakashi glared, "Why are you trying to escape?" Temari just smiled, "Because you captured me, isn't it normal to run away?" "Then why haven't you run away from him?" Kakashi said angrily. Temari's mind was working at warp speed. Despite her outward confidence, she had no hope of winning. She didn't have her fan or any time to prepare a plan of acti. Prepare. Suddenly all of Naruto's annoying comments made sense. Mizu Gyushoku no Jutsu and Kaze Ninsho no Jutsu weren't supposed to be combined, one was a preparation for the other. Willing to gamble, she ignored Kakashi's question and started to run through now familiar seals. As expected, the copy ninja held true to his name and immediately started to imitate her seals. They both finished the seals and called out at the same time, Mizu Gyushoku no Jutsu. Neither moved as the water started to gather. Within seconds, both were soaked and the air around them was filled with water droplets. Kakashi was perplexed. He had been slightly nervous when Temari had started into hand seals without answering his question, but the jutsu didn't do anything except make you wet. Temari just stood there, hoping beyond hope that Naruto was nearby. If he weren't, Kakashi would be kicking her ass any minute now. It was at that moment that Tenten fell from the trees. Literally. The weapon's master hit the ground with a crunch and lay still. Kakashi's Sharingan started to spin as he looked at Tenten. He felt righteous anger building up inside him and subconsciously started the hand seals for Chidori. He probably would have finished them too if Sirai Kirite hadn't flown out of the trees, heading straight to Temari. If the huge sword flying towards her unnerved the girl, she didn't show it. A million possibilities went through Kakashi's mind. Was Naruto going to kill her and blame it on the leaf? As the blade was only a few fractions of a second from impact, Temari reached out with her hand and deftly caught her fan as the Sirai Kirite clone poofed into non-existence. Using the fan's own momentum to snap it open and spin, Temari forced all the chakra she had into one final jutsu. Kaze Ninsho no Jutsu, Kikaki. Burning Wind's technique, Vaporizer. All the water that had collected on her body and in the air turned instantly to steam as the air was lit on fire. Kakashi only managed the oh sure, before he was engulfed by a wave of superheated mist and consumed by agony. Some of the steam condensed on the copy ninja's body and continued to burn him as he thrashed on the ground. When the air started to cool and clear up, Kakashi just lay on his back, trying not to move. A shadow suddenly fell over him and he met a set of dark red eyes. I suppose this is the end for the great copy ninja? Kakashi said without mirth. Naruto shook his head. No, there's a message I want you to take to Tsunade for me. Kakashi raised his singed eyebrow. Go ahead, I'm not going anywhere. Naruto thought for a moment and started casually. As far as I know, your whole team is alive, assuming Ibiki and Enko managed to use healing jutsus before they bled to death, so you can be happy about that. More importantly, I want you to know that if I ever catch even a whiff of the scent of leaf hunters ever again, I'm going to find and kill them while they sleep. Naruto grinned slightly. And if anyone from your village ever lays a hand on one of my precious people ever again. Naruto's eyes suddenly started to glow. Then I will go back to Konoha and burn it to the ground. Naruto's eyes lost their glow and he smiled again. Do we understand each other? Kakashi nodded painfully. Good. Naruto turned to Temari, who had been panting while leaning on her fan. Ready? Temari nodded tiredly. The sun had set, but at that moment she wanted to get far away from their current location as possible. Without further exchange of words, the two Nukenin started to run. Tsunade shot upwards in bed, her body soaked with cold sweat. She had been having a horrible nightmare, but couldn't remember any of what it had been about. She rested a hand on her chest and felt her heart pounding. The fifth was not the type of person to be superstitious, but she would swear for the rest of her life that as she lay there in bed, she somehow knew the team's scent after Naruto had been beaten. Feeling a dark sense of dread well up from deep within her, she remembered that she had once read part of a poem that she had thought effectively summed up the life of a shinobi. There's not to make reply. There's not to reason why. There's but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. She had only sent 8 people, not 600, but she had sent them on a mission not because the village needed Naruto, but because she as a person cared about him. If they died, she knew she would never forgive herself their deaths. Only a short distance away, Sabaka no Gaara sat on the ground, watching the moon. He sat cross-legged, staring up into the sky, wondering how Temari was doing. He would be the first to admit that he had never exactly showered his siblings with affection, but Temari's absence had been affecting him deeply. Gaara had been pondering something the Hokage had said to him a few days earlier, that you don't know what you have until it's gone. He was finding that to be disturbingly true. The sand shifted slightly as someone sat down beside him. It took Gaara only a moment to realize it was Kankuro lacking his face paint and body suit. The sand settled and the two sat in silence, the only sound being the wind as it rustled through the trees. Finally, it was Gaara who broke the silence. Not sleeping well. No, not really, Kankuro answered, only half paying attention. Seems quiet without her, doesn't it? Kankuro answered again. How do you think she's doing? Okay, I guess, she's with that Naruto kid, and he's tough as nails, said Kankuro. Gaara nodded with a small smile, that he is. And so they sat in silence, each reflecting on their own thoughts. Temari collapsed against a tree in exhaustion sometime around 3 a.m. Naruto had decided they had gone far enough that they weren't likely to be found. He set up the two sleeping bags next to each other, and helped Temari to hers before stripping to the waist and crawling into his own. The two really hadn't spoken since their flight from the battlefield, and a great deal was hanging awkwardly between them. Most of the awkwardness was on Temari's side, and she felt the need to talk despite her fatigue. I wanted to, I guess, say thank you. Naruto just looked confused. For what? Temari's nervousness was suddenly replaced with incredulity. For coming to help me escape. Naruto thought for a moment, then let out a dark laugh. Don't thank me for that. I went against my village, and don't care if people call me scum, but shinobi who leave their comrades behind are worse than scum, and even I refuse to sink that low. He suddenly rolled over so they were facing each other, but even beyond that, you are on the very short list of people who are precious to me. Temari tried to cover a blush as Naruto continued, if you ever want to leave, I won't stop you, but until that day, anyone who wants to mess with you has to kill me first. Temari just lay there as Naruto rolled back over, and a few minutes later, started to snore. When she did start to drift herself, her mind was still filled with the memory of his final words. Chapter 16, Cloudy, with a slight chance of idiocy. Iruka sat with his head in his hands, surrounded by his team. Anko, Ibiki, and Kakashi looked somewhat like mummies with the number of bandages they were wearing, but weren't in any mortal danger. Tenten had only broken an arm and a leg, and Shikamaru had a slight concussion. Shizen stood next to Iruka as the only other uninjured member of the squad, while the now stable Niji lay unconscious next to her. The brown-haired hunter looked up at the people gathered around him. How could this happen? He asked quietly. How could we let this happen? Everyone, minus the still conked-out Niji, looked down at the ground. Shikamaru had taken it the hardest and hadn't spoken for hours. He felt that the whole ordeal had been his fault and refused to accept anyone's comfort. Iruka let his gaze burn into each of them and raised his voice. Mistakes were made, mistakes that should be impossible for shinobi of your caliber to make. I am still waiting for a decent explanation. Iruka was about to start openly yelling when Kakashi cut him off. I ordered that no lethal force be used. Their brown-haired leader's voice suddenly dropped to a dangerously quiet tone. What? Kakashi continued on, once you left with Shizen and Niji, I gave Enko and Ibiki an order to refrain from using lethal force, and if they made contact before I did, to make sure that I knew before anything else. Iruka's voice was still calm, but his eyes betrayed his anger. And why exactly did you do that? Because I didn't want anyone to kill Naruto before I got to see him. Even if I would have agreed, that sort of plan needs to be cleared with the mission leader. What were you going to do if someone had been killed? I figured that as Naruto has shown a reluctance to kill people who were his friends as he grew up, and as Enko and Ibiki can take care of themselves, there wouldn't be a problem. Kakashi answered, still aggravatingly composed, turns out I was right. Iruka started to steam, but still. We planned for days, and then you decide to make a last-minute change that might be the reason Mark escaped. Kakashi gave Iruka a significant look. That was the point. Iruka took a step back. You do realize what you're implying. Kakashi turned to Shizen and smiled. Would you mind taking Niji, Shikamaru, and Tenten to the river? I think their bandages need to be changed and their wounds cleaned. Everyone noticing the extremely obvious attempt to get rid of the younger team members, they quietly left, Tenten helping carry Niji. Once they were gone, Kakashi and Iruka resumed their face-off. What you're suggesting is treason, Iruka said as he simmered. Kakashi waved his finger back and forth. No, Iruka, it is you who has failed to see underneath the underneath. Kakashi sat up. First question, Iruka, who is the most important person involved in this mission? Iruka was slightly taken aback. Obviously, the target, Naru. Wrong. Kakashi cut him off. He is but a single missing nin with no vendetta against us. He just wants to be left alone, and in this he is predictable, so who then? Iruka's eyes widened. Kakashi smiled under his bandages. Very good, I see you understand. Gaara's power and influence is a very real threat to Konoha, and so his sister therefore becomes very important. Iruka was annoyed with the copy ninja's condescending tone but let it slide. I had suspicions from the moment I started my surveillance in preparation of our mission, Kakashi continued, and they were later confirmed. I only watched their interaction for a minute or two, but even then it was obvious that not only did Naruto care for and feel responsible for the girl, she cared about him. This, he continued, became even more obvious when she made an escape attempt. She wanted to go back and make sure he was okay. To be completely sure, I even asked her why she was going back to Naruto, and in this case, Kakashi held out his bandaged arms. Actions spoke louder than words. She stays with him voluntarily. Irika was starting to understand, but didn't like where the facts were leading him. Kakashi continued to speak in his lecturing voice. That kind of devotion is rare, so even if we had killed Naruto and taken Temari back to the sand, her and Gaara's influence could ruin relations between our villages. That would be bad enough, so I'm not going to mention what might happen if one of us had to tell Sabaka no Gaara his sister was killed defending Naruto from us. The commander was now feeling somewhat ashamed of his short-sightedness, but was still plenty annoyed as Kakashi went on. And then of course, he said, there's the fact that we got our butts so thoroughly kicked that Naruto would have escaped either way. Irika cut in, but I'm sure we could beat him if we used our resources better, even if Kyuubi is helping him. Kakashi nodded. Maybe and maybe not. Naruto's speed and coordination have improved exponentially. I have no doubt that he would take at least a few of us down before he died. Either way, it's beside the point. We have no reason to go after him again, and honestly, none of us want to anyway. Irika deflated. So what are we going to tell the Hokage then? Ibiki cut in. We'll tell her the truth. Naruto has escaped but is not a threat to our village so long as we do not provoke him. Tsunade will like this better, so she won't argue. Irika nodded. Are we sure of that? He really isn't out for vengeance? Yes, Kakashi said. He threatened to attack Konoha, but only if we went after him first. We stay out of his way, and he and Temari stay out of ours. Irika sunk a little lower and nodded in resignation. Then I suppose that pretty much covers everything. Looking relatively disappointed, the brown-haired man turned and dismissed his team with a wave of his hand before walking off. Kakashi watched him for a moment then turned. Enko, follow him. Now is the time for Irika to hear what you have to say. She nodded, and rushed to follow the disappearing brown ponytail, the only sign of her injury being a slight limp. She made a mental note to get a really nice present for Shizun once they were back home. Enko finally caught up to Irika when he was sitting at the base of a tree, holding his hunter mask up to the sun and looking at how the light shone through the ice slits. She sat next to him and watched silently for a moment, before interrupting his thoughts. So we can go home, tell Gaara his sister is fine and thereby prevent Konoha getting stomped. Everyone is still alive, yet our fearless leader is moping about something. Irika glared. We come all the way out here, spending every ounce of time we have preparing, and yet he paused for a moment, still haven't completed my mission. That, the brazen Jounin replied, was not what you were going to say. And since you're too much of a baby to say it, I will for you. You put all this effort in and still, in the end, you didn't even get to see Naruto's face. Irika set the mask down and rested his head back against the tree. I'm not sure whether I still love Naruto or hate him. We were always so similar, but now he goes and does something like this. Enko sighed, and of course, you start to remember when you considered running away from Konoha. He had snapped to the side. How do you know that? She stood on the other side of the tree. It's far more common than you might think, Irika. Most shinobi consider leaving at one time or another, and when someone does, everyone else worries that someday his or her loyalty might wane. I, of course, being the prime example. Irika had just a hint of curiosity on his face, so Enko continued. When Orochimaru first left, I was furious, but not because he had betrayed the village or because he had created some forbidden jutsus. I felt crushed that he hadn't taken me with him. All I cared about was the fact that he abandoned me. She paused for a moment to let it sink in, then went on. It has been many years since he left, and even with him dead, I feel no sense of closure. There is a part of me that always has and always will see Orochimaru as the man who used to carry me around Konoha on his shoulders, pointing out people and explaining how to learn things about them just by observing how they acted. I still use his advice today. So essentially, Irika said dryly, what you're saying is that I'll be haunted by this for the rest of my life? Enko shook her head. Nah, you'll probably be dark and depressed for a month or two, but things will soon get back to normal. Besides, you might even meet Naruto on amiable terms again someday. Irika laughed slightly. You talk of him as if you still like him, even after he mangled your leg. She sighed again and rested a hand on Irika's head. When you've ruined and killed as many people as I have, you'll understand that holding a grudge has never done anyone any good. Irika just sat in contemplation as she got up and left, failing to hear her grumble under her breath. Though I would like to see the brat try to fight me without his precious sword. Stupid long weapons, it's like cheating. As she was just about to jump into the trees, Irika got up. "So," he asked, "did any actual good come out of this?" Anko forgot her grumbling and smiled. "Well, I will have a neat new battle scar," she winked at him. "If you're lucky, I might show it to you someday." Irika's mind took a few seconds to process the above statement. She had been cut on her left side, from her inner thigh, up through her leg and halfway up her side. So showing him the scar would require her to remove almost all her CLO. He blushed. It has been said that there are times when people focus so much on a single goal, they forget about the big picture. Naruto lay on the ground, staring at the sky. They were less than a day from Hidden Cloud. He had absolutely no idea what he was going to do when he got there. So far, the best he had come up with was wandering around with a "we'll do B-rank missions for food" sign, but figured that wouldn't go over too well with the local authorities. A short distance away, Temari sat examining the chessboard. Naruto had been telling the truth, she decided. The bastard fox was good. She was just about to move a piece when a repetitive thumping sound distracted her. Naruto was beating his head against the ground in frustration, and failed to notice his audience. It wasn't until he heard laughing that he stopped and looked up. "Rather than amusing yourself at my expense, how about you try to come up with something yourself," he said, sounding only slightly annoyed. Temari snickered and went back to trying to take the Kyuubi's queen. "Who says we need to start doing missions right away?" Temari said distractedly as she played. "Why not just start off doing some odd jobs and getting a feel for the town?" Naruto spent a moment just sitting there, trying to come up with a retort. He couldn't. After noticing his silence, Temari turned to look at him. "See? You just think too linearly." Realizing she was right, again, Naruto just flopped back down and stared up at the sky, mumbling about know-it-all sand means. Temari absent-mindedly picked up one of her training water balloons and threw it at him. The two arrived at the hidden cloud just as night was falling and the gate was being closed. As they had no passports and really weren't supposed to be there, they waited until the gate was fully shut and started walking around the outer perimeter of the wall. There were never enough guards to have a constant vigil all along the wall, so they moved in shifts. After half an hour of observation, Naruto and Temari waited for a patrol to pass and jumped over the wall, landing quietly on the other side. Upon the mutual decision that they didn't have money for a hotel, the first order of business was to find an area to sleep. Temari suggested they look for a training area within the city walls, as they would be generally deserted at night, and not 30 minutes later, they found just such a place. Spending only a moment to hide their bag in some brush, the two Nukanins found themselves with a whole village to explore. Naruto insisted that he needed new wrappings for his sword, and set off to find a fabric shop while Temari went to buy food. Naruto wandered through the crowds of people, holding his sword at his side and trying to make it as subtle as a 9-foot sword can be. It only took half an hour to get his wrappings and wrap up Kirite, so Naruto amused himself by sitting on top of a building and examining his surroundings. As had been the case in Hidden Cloud looked like any other village. Various people, with or without forehead protectors, wandered by, going about their business. He just sat and watched for about 20 minutes, then realized he needed to get back, and bounced across the rooftops back to their designated sleeping area. Temari barely even twitched as Naruto dropped down next to her and grabbed up a cup of instant ramen. "Water?" he asked grumpily. Temari handed him a pot of warm water and he poured it over his ramen. She looked him over slowly for a moment. "What could have possibly happened in the last hour to annoy you so much?" Naruto poked at his still hard ramen. "I was just watching people." "Why is it," Temari said semi-rhetorically, "that the people blessed with the greatest power always envy those with no power whatsoever?" Naruto snorted. "Here's a imaginary situation for you. I'm in a bank when it is being robbed. I have to decide whether to use my great power or not, and my decision either way could cost people their lives. Robbers are evil by most people's definition, but so am I. Do I kill them? Do I help them? What should I do?" Despite the fact that it was just a hypothetical situation, Temari found herself trying hard to come up with an answer. He gave her a few seconds and observed her confusion. Whoever it was, Naruto continued, that said that responsibility comes with power wasn't referring to being spiritually bound to a demon, but the principle applies all the same. "I didn't ask for my power, but when the pressure's on, I have to make a decision, hoping it's the right one." He paused for a moment and looked off into space. Then again, how do I even decide what right is? That statement just hung in the air for a moment, then Temari shook her head slightly. "Okay, that's enough philosophy for now, my brain is hurting." I'll never understand how people like you and Gaara can just ponder these things all day long and still be sane. Naruto raised an eyebrow. Sane? It suddenly occurred to Temari that Gaara was best known for his random squishing of people and sand that was alive, while Naruto, on the other hand, was a perfect gentleman whenever he wasn't busy killing things, and had a talking sword that played a mean game of chess. Never mind, she muttered. Smirking, Naruto started to eat his semi-cooked ramen. Naruto and Temari slept side by side, as was their custom, so when Naruto was rudely awakened, he bumped into the sleepy sand girl beside him, and both of them immediately started to realize that the noise that had woken them was actually someone talking, just very loudly. What do we have here? A young couple, no doubt fleeing from oppression to elope together and live out their dreams. How I am inspired. Naruto closed his eyes, slowly counted to 5, and opened them again. The obnoxious man was still there. It seemed the fates truly hated him. Naruto smiled. Who are you, and why the hell are you waking me up this early? He and Temari had just gotten to sleep a couple of hours before and were looking forward to at least another 4 hours. The man said, am serious, and you need to vacate our field, young man, so my glorious students may train their bodies and minds so as to better burn with flaming passion. We must start before the sun rises so as to allow more time for our great pursuit. Temari was now also fully awake and noticed 3 children standing behind the man, all looking somewhat exasperated and embarrassed. Naruto just glared. It figured that every village had its weirdos, but why they always managed to congregate around him was a mystery. Fine, Naruto said as he climbed out of his bag and put on his vest, ignoring the blushing of various observers. He looked at Temari pointedly, but she shook her head. I don't care if this is their field, I'm not getting out of my bag with them watching. The 4 Cloud Nines, for it was obvious that was what they were, immediately jumped and turned, the 2 young girls still blushing from Naruto's brazen shirtlessness. Temari was struck by the surrealism as she rushed to change out of her nightshirt and into her regular clothes. Only with Naruto would she be dressing at 4 a.m. next to the turned backs of unknown shinobi. She was just glad she had removed her forehead protector before turning in. Once Temari was dressed, Naruto quickly packed their sleeping bags and everyone just stood awkwardly for a moment. Sirius, however, soon banished the awkwardness with raw enthusiasm, as he grabbed his pupils and pulled them in front of him. Alas, I forget my manners. Students. How could we displace these people from their resting place without first introducing ourselves? All 3 sighed collectively, but the first girl stepped forward and suddenly exploded with enthusiasm. Nimbus, the silent rain. The second girl jumped up to join her. Cumulus, the lightning fist. The boy did a flip and landed between them. Stratus, shinobi of 1,000 faces. Naruto and Temari just held their gear and stared blankly, but it wasn't over yet. The annoying Jounin suddenly appeared behind his students and thrust his finger into the sky. Sirius, the human hurricane. And together we are. They all called in unison. Cloud Team 5, the storm of righteous fury. Naruto had seen many things in his life, but he was currently standing with his mouth agape, reconsidering whether he wanted to stay in Hidden Cloud. Once their intro was over, the 3 students sighed again and hung their heads as their teacher clapped happily. Well done, you 3. I expect that kind of performance in your training today as well. At this point, Temari had taken hold of Naruto's arm and the 2 were backing away slowly, when Sirius suddenly spun back to them. You must not leave yet. In return for the use of our field, I ask nothing more than the stories of the many trials and tribulations that have brought 2 passionate young people such as yourselves to a place like this. Will you not stay? Naruto froze up for a minute. Temari was pulling on his arm, trying to drag him away, but he suddenly got an idea. A wonderful, amazing, dastardly idea. I would like nothing more, Naruto said with a grin, than to pass on my story so that it might inspire future generations. Temari looked at him as if he had grown another head, but Sirius was practically beaming, and waved off his students while leading the 2 Nukenin over to a log and sitting down. Cumulus, Nimbus, and Stratus started into some basic warm-up exercises while Naruto and Temari sat with Sirius on the log. Well, Naruto started off thoughtfully, my tale begins many years ago, when my older brother murdered my entire family. That's it for part 2. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.